Welcome to the Mad Ones. My bald head gets cold, so I bought a cowboy hat host, Cam Harless. And with me, as always, is your favorite flat earther, Miss Jessica Green.
What?
How are you doing, Jessica?
My-
And why do you think the moon is a hologram?
Oh, there are reasons. No, I come on, man. I'm related to a physicist. You're gonna get me in trouble. I'm gonna have stuff to explain at dinner time now. Oh man.
Oh, you gotta love it.
No,
All
but
right.
I'm excited. I'm excited about tonight. I think we're about to discuss some really interesting ideas. So I'm eager. Let's go.
Eager, very eager. So, before we get started, I do want to tell you that this show is 100% brought to you by fans and patrons. So hit like, subscribe, share the show with your friends. We've done all sorts of topics, and share them with someone that you think might gain something from them. Also, join our Patreon for the occasional early episode. We'll have Zoom hangouts, and I'll be grateful. Jessica will be grateful, and we'll tell you that we're grateful. And I mean, what more could you ask for? You can also grab a shirt, a mug, or a tank top, which is the preferred shirt of the Mad Ones, over at wearethemadones.com/store. And you can show off our logo anywhere you go. But let's get to the meat and potatoes, as it were. Joining tonight is the host of A Neighbor's Choice. He's a seed oil disrespecter, a fan of physics, a marketer of mimetic theory, and a proponent of Jesus' personhood revolution, Mr. David Gornoski. I can't speak. I'm so sorry.
Well, so glad to be with you guys. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here.
And before the show, I just realized that we're just down the road from each other, Cam. It's so great to know that. Won't you be my neighbor, huh?
Right. I mean, I didn't expect, because I'd seen you at an event, I think in Tampa, and I was like, so when I saw your picture on Twitter, I was like, I've met this guy. I know I've been in the same room with this person before. And you asked me where I live, and I told you the specific city, which I'm not going to tell everyone. But you're like, yeah, you're just down the road. So
yeah,
that's cool. Maybe there are cool people around here after all.
Yeah. And Jessica, where do you hail from? Where are you from?
I'm in the Metro Atlanta area.
Okay.
Yeah. So, basically, I mean, we're within a stone's throw of each other with cars.
Yeah.
Within a car's throw of each other.
And how's Atlanta doing? I like that show, Atlanta. That's a pretty surreal show. I like that FX show.
I do my best to stay on the outskirts of the city area for the most part. I prefer it out in the country, and we're doing our best to avoid the sprawl, as California, New York, and every other overpopulated place is kind of pouring into our area. The locals are fleeing and trying to get out to the country. So
we need to have some kind of way of debugging these folks that come over to these failing states so that they can get debugged and ready to go with a proper mind and a proper meal,
So I was told a lot of the people who come, especially from LA and New York, they don't want to lose their street cred as an LA or New York person. So they refuse to get their licenses changed over to Georgia licenses for as long as they possibly can, which, kind of keeps them out of the voter pool. And I'm sort of cool with that. I think that's
so they're like LA people living in exile. Amongst the heathens and the savages, right? That's what
I'm sure there's some who see it that way for sure.
Yeah.
Savage Atlantans with their chicken bones all over the ground.
I try to warn them when they come in that you might see chicken bones. There are a lot of chicken bones. I wasn't making it up.
Are they doing hexes or something with them?
No. I think people just it's something I came from Florida originally. So when I moved up to Atlanta, I just noticed like, hey, there's an awful lot of like bones on the sidewalk. And it's just something that it seems to be unique to the city of Atlanta that people eat their chicken and throw the bones aside. And I told my friend who came from LA that she would see that, and that's how she would know she was in Atlanta. She sent me a picture of a bone, her first bone that she saw. And she's like, I thought you were making that up. And I was like, why, how or why would I come up with that story? So,
oh my goodness, wow.
It's also happens to be unique to Georgia is every now and then they find, like last time it happened was 2 years ago, where the what river is it? The Chattahoochee River. They find decapitated goat bodies.
Oh, that's
200. Like, what Santeria is this?
That might have something to do with Texas. I can't speak to that.
Well, you guys are doing a perfect transition for our topic today about sacrifice. A lovely topic there.
Yes.
Yeah, let's talk about goats.
I was thinking about that. I was like, man, Atlanta may have chicken bones everywhere, but LA probably's got human bones just sitting on the sidewalk everywhere with everything declining so rapidly as it's been, huh? Goodness.
Might be.
Yeah.
And of course, intravenous needles.
Oh, that too.
Yeah.
I'm I'm less offended by the idea of the needles. Like I'm desensitized to that imagery, but the idea of the bones is much more like, oh, I don't know why.
Goat bodies is just
Yeah.
incredible.
Yeah. That's
like 200.
Yep.
So I do think that's the best segue I could have ever come up with, by the way. I mean, I nailed that, and I should pat myself on the back and then say, hey, let's talk about goats.
right.
Let's talk about scapegoats. So you have a show called A Neighbor's Choice.
Right.
Can you tell us about what you do and
Yeah, we do it's a live old school FM AM radio show that we do feature online as well as a podcast and a live stream. But our primary focus is doing the radio medium justice because it's a totally underutilized, underappreciated medium to use, to tell interesting stories in a live way. And so I've been doing that for a few years, and it's a drive time show from 5 to 7 p.m. Weekdays.
Nice.
Each week we've been doing this new format where one day a week, Jeff Dice, the president of the Mises Institute, guest hosts a show of mine with his all-star lineup of Mises people. And I wanted to do that because a lot of the economic declines that we're seeing, I wanted to give people a real heavy, because when you're in broadcast media, you're preaching to a different audience than a podcast, right? Because a podcast, typically people found you because they have a name or a topic that they're looking for that you're related to. But when you're doing broadcasts, you don't know who you're going to catch. It's like you're casting out a big net, and you're going to get people who don't know anything about Joe Rogan or who that is or whatever. So it's a whole new world out there. I thought, now with the economic decline and everything, let's give a broadcast mainstream normie audience a heavy dose of economic education each week with Jeff Dice and his friends. So that's been a really great thing to see that. But yeah, we do a live show. Then I also do a deep dive anthropology show called Things Hidden, which I do about one of those a week online. So yeah, it's a podcast and a radio show. And it's been a lot of fun taking the headlines of our time, the current events, the news going on in the world, and then using history and anthropology as like a special toolkit in your back pocket to be able to understand, okay, so this isn't just a random thing. There's a reason why this is happening. And if you understand the historical trajectory we're on, then you can kind of you can see intelligence in what's happening. You kind of figure out, okay, this makes sense now. This is not just random chaos.
Right. That's I first encountered the idea of mimetic theory from you in 2019. I heard you on Bob Murphy's show, and it was one of those ideas that kind of like, this really alters my perspective on the way that I had, in read a lot of, you have to contextualize the Bible when you read it, but it's so much more than just contextualization. It's like intent is also, what is the intent of the Bible? And I had never been exposed to an idea like that before. The idea of mimetic theory coming from Rene Girard. You recommended a CBC interview by Rene Girard. I forget the host name. I'm so sorry to him that I forgot him.
David Cayley, yeah.
Thank you. He did such a great job, and it's not fair to forget him in this moment. But that interview, I recommend everybody to watch if anything that we're going to talk about might seem a little bit like I've never heard these terms before. But I thought that it was extraordinary, and I'm so excited to talk about it because at the time when I heard that idea, I was still very much in sort of like an atheistic, secular kind of camp ideologically, and it gave me an opportunity that came in confluence with the time that I was becoming disillusioned with my political ideas. Like right at the exact moment, it was like a lightning bolt. struck me with that. And I was like, this is so interesting. And it's surreal to be able to, this is many years on now from 2019, believe it or not. We've progressed in time, and I'm actually able to talk to you about these ideas. And I wanted you to know how like truly excited I am about that.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's a big transformative thing for me. You know, when I discovered Ron Paul, and I accepted capitalism into my heart many years ago, in 2007, in that original campaign, that was a big moment for me because at the time they had these ideas that we weren't allowed to know about, like the Federal Reserve and national ID and all these things. He was talking about globalism before anybody was talking about it. I mean, Pat Buchanan and all that, but that was before my time. And so Ron Paul wakes me up to this. And then the next big wake up moment I had was Rene Girard, you know? So it's something about these people with two first names as a name, you know, that seem to come in, and they're always around the same age, like that guru age. And it happens like every 10 years or something. I don't know who the next guru is. I just interviewed a guy that I've been getting to know for some time, a little bit in recent years. He's 86. His name's Dr. Ray P., also two first names. And he has a revolutionary approach about seed oils. I'm like, maybe that's the next moment. So it's Ron Paul, then Rene Girard, then Ray P. I don't know. But, you know, you just look at rhythms in your life and try to make sense of it all. But yeah, I mean, Rene Girard revolutionized my perspective in a lot of ways, because I always felt like, you know, the way in which Christianity is talked about within a lot of Christian circles is kind of like a disembodied, just another deity. Like you're supposed to figure out, all right, tell me who the God is. Okay, you've made a case that it's this guy, not that one. Okay. And who do I say my prayers to at night? Okay, that one. Okay. And so you just kind of like, all right, it's Jesus. All right, I'll take that one. Sounds like that's the big best option I've been persuaded to assent mentally to, right? And that ends up being how Christianity is presented in a lot of ways. I don't think it's necessarily at all what Jesus had in mind. And there's a lot of ways to look at this, but one way to think about it is, you know, Jesus changed the world whether you believe in him or not. He's saving you in sense of you all. He's saving you all, the world, whether you believe certain things about him or not. Right. And the way in which Jesus has been taught in a popular sense, in America at least, has been almost, in a metaphor I've used is like, or analogy is like telling young black children that the only way in which they can receive the benefits of Martin Luther King's impact in their life is if they believe he existed and they believe he did certain things. And then and only then can you experience the impact and the reality that he left in history. That's ridiculous. That's how Jesus is taught. But we know that whether you know about Martin Luther King or not, you get to drink at the same water fountain. There is no segregation at the water fountain, right? You don't have to believe something to participate in the reality of it. You see what I mean? And so that's the way Jesus has been introduced to people. Like he's this little private experience kind of thing that you believe this certain thing, and then you try really hard, and different traditions have different rituals that you must do. And I'm not against all of that per se, but the way in which he's explained, it just feels like you've got a collection of superhero characters like Avengers, and those are different gods, and you pick the one that seems to, you know, fit with you the best, and then you just take a leap of faith, and then you compartmentalize your faith away from everything else. It's such totally opposite. It's a Gnostic kind of different religion, you know?
Gnosticism is a huge issue in mainstream Christianity, and it's something I've talked about on this show, I think. If not, I need to do a full episode on that somewhat, because there's so many different points in the way we talk about Jesus and theology and ourselves. Our own anthropology is based on Gnosticism or even just ancient Greek Platonic ideas that are not Jewish or Christian. And so it's wild to me that we've gotten to that place, and how it's the same fights. Like, I don't know if you have paid too much attention to social media, and particularly TikTok. It's going wild on TikTok. But the Hebrew roots, the Judaizers, as they were back in history, are back and are telling Christians that they can't be Christians unless they follow the Mosaic law. And it's like,
Mhm.
how are we in this day and age still fighting the same fights that Paul fought?
Mhm. Well, that goes to the the way, this kind of jumping ahead of the story, I guess, if we're going to talk about mimetic theory, but the way that groups, the human beings, we want to be a part of tribes. We have our identity
Right.
in tribes, and people feel the need to want to have a tangible objectification of God, and that God could
Sure.
be the ultimate good. That's
Mhm.
the COVID cult has their own objective rituals and things that they can say this is what it means to be a good citizen, and if you don't
Right.
do these
Right.
things, that you're on the out group. And I think this problem exists in everything, including in Jesus's church, is that you get this desire to say, I don't like this imitation of Jesus thing. I'd rather fence this off so that I can feel safe psychologically that my tribe is superior. And then I can keep my sense of self intact by coming together and mutually purging and excluding people who violate those certain kind of fencing dogmas that I've put around my team. And that is like a shortcut to that transcendent feeling of oneness that a group and a religion provides. I mean, that's what the word religion means. It means to bind together, right? What
Mhm.
binds us together? Religions
Mhm.
are just the foundation of culture itself. So that's why everything you do has a religion to it. If you like Star Wars, it becomes a religion. If you like skateboarding, it's a religion. If you like fishing, if you like country music, different. And then within each group, there's constant schisms where people are breaking away from that group and saying, no, we are the pure truth, and that is the garbage. And then they
Right.
schism and they break, and it's just continual schism. The reason why it's continual schism is because of what Jesus did in history. Anthropologically, he destroyed the unanimity of culture. He destroyed our ability to bind together in a transcendent oneness that would truly make people feel united and whole, and kind of cathartically relieved of their tensions. And so, because Jesus destroyed the pagan sacred, because he destroyed Rene Girard says that religion is the placenta of human beings. That's how we came to be, and we don't want to accept that. We want to think religion is kind of like this weird thing that we kind of picked up along the way to kind of deal with our imagination and our desire for play, and this kind of extra stuff that we added on whenever the thunderbolts came. Oh, let's gather around the fire and tell a good story together. That's the
Yeah.
way modern anthropology and our modern myth that we inherit as modernists, we kind of think of religion like that, kind of a bad habit that has some utility if we want to be nice, like a Jordan Peterson, but is really just kind of just kind of superfluous to the true root of who we are.
Right.
Um, and Girard just throws that completely out the door and says, no, religion is the placenta by which we become human. And he would go so far as to say that religion is how we became human. It's how we completed our harmonization, is through stumbling into this pattern of sacrificial or kind of a collective lynching of a
Right.
common threat that somehow has a marker of difference that stands out from the rest of us in an arbitrary way.
Because I came to Christianity from a secular point of view, the problem of violence within the context of religion is something that is really important to me. And it's something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. And so, what I liked about what Girard had to say was not this sort of like hand waving about how primitive people used to be. And that's why there was violence then, and there's not violence now, or there's less violence now. And instead, he actually does a sort of like what I believe to be an honest look at the human condition, and addresses there's sort of like an inherent violence in our condition that
Mm.
takes its toll, takes its cycle. And I was hoping perhaps, as someone who explores this theory and idea quite a bit over the course of many years and many podcasts, you could maybe enlighten me a little more to these ideas.
Yeah, like
if we a primer for those for the uninitiated would be nice.
yeah. Well,
Right,
just to
right.
address that one thing, what you were saying about the primitive thing is true, because when Girard was looking at anthropology, he's looking at first at 19th century anthropologists whose bias at the time would be to do just that, to say, oh, there was the primitive superstitious stuff, and now we're separate from that in our modern world.
Mhm.
But when he comes into academia in the 20th century, it's going the opposite way, where it's now Rousseauian, the noble savage, everything's perfect in its state of nature. And now we in our institutions in Christianity and all the things that come with that have kind of corrupted the pure human being, right? And so there's a bias to say everything's bad, from the Western institutions and patriarchy and Christianity and all these capitalism and colonialism, all these little things that get added on. But yeah, it's the accurate thing, I think, would be to say that yes, that human tendency to sin, the systemic sin of society, has been with us since the beginning, and it's still with us, although it hides itself in a more creative way now, right? And
Right.
so yeah, but you got to start with the foundations of mimetic theory to build to that. I don't know how far you want to go with that, because you could spend many podcasts on just the first part of mimetic theory about human desire. So how far do you want to go with that part versus the scapegoating part? People in my political podcast friends want to go to the scapegoating really fast. The mimetic stuff is more,
maybe we can do this more than once and hit it in different parts. Maybe you'd
Yeah.
be interested in hitting it again later. But I do think, let's hit the basics. And if we don't hit scapegoating, I'll just rename. No, I won't rename the episode. I'll just be even more clever with the next one.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
I just broke my mug while you were saying
Oh,
that.
I'm so sorry.
Oh my goodness.
Oh no. That's
You
a blood
cannot-
sacrifice to the
Yeah, thank you for
podcasting
doing that.
gods.
That was a good show and tell visual for what we're doing.
What
Right.
on earth? All right.
All right.
So yeah, let's
There will
while
be
Cam
blood, huh?
bleeds- So while Cam bleeds, maybe we can get I guess the primer for the uninitiated, as he was saying about the basics of what is mimetic theory. Somebody wandering and hearing that term, not knowing. Oh,
I do believe he is frozen.
it's usually me that's frozen. So
There you
hooray
go.
for me. Oh, are you
There
there?
we go.
Hi.
Yeah. So let's try this again. So mimetic theory is a theory created by Rene Girard. He passed away in 2015. His last known post in academia was at Stanford, where he was most known in America. But he was born in France. He had a background as a historian. He came to America and spent most of his academic career in America at various universities, Johns Hopkins University, but he landed at Stanford, and he was kind of a throwback to an older kind of theorist, where you try to create a grand unified theory to explain multiple disciplines and multiple facts. And he
Like
was
Hegel?
doing that. Was that?
Is it kind of Hegelian?
Yeah, like the old school, where you kind of give a grand unified theory. When at the time he's doing this, though, it was in vogue to be very much, deconstruction and granular and going into what does the text reveal about the reader and all this. But he's saying, okay, what are the patterns? And he first starts off with literature. He's looking at the grand best works of Western literature, novels. He looks at the plays of Shakespeare. He looks at Cervantes. He looks at all these different pieces, and he sees a common triangular structure to conflict in these different great dramas. And he says, well, maybe these great authors that we carry on through the ages are great because they all stumble upon a secret of human nature that really hits us at our core and causes us to kind of be shaken and change our perspective. And so he looks at that common pattern by looking at the characters and the way they do, and he notices that it's kind of a triangular pattern, that human beings, that these novels show, they desire not things because of their own objective or truly original want for such things. They desire things because other people around them are desiring them. So they're copying their desires. That's where we get the word mimetic. Now, mimetic in popular Twitter world becomes mixed up with that word meme theory and mimetic warfare, which is a different topic. I mean, there are some corollary overlap thoughts there, but it's really a different thing. But mimetic comes from that mimesis, and he wanted to use the word mimesis instead of imitation because he wanted to show that it wasn't just rote imitation like we think of, like monkey see, monkey do. You stick
Right.
your tongue at somebody, they stick their tongue back at you. That kind of is what imitation is typically thought of. So he uses the classical word mimesis to indicate desiring what we assume other people are trying to desire or acquire, right? And the reason why we desire those things is because our brains, we are hypermimetic. We see mirror neurons showing evidence for this, that when they watch these the subject in the lab and they perceive somebody else having pain in their knee, that the same neural pathway lights up in the person observing the pain in the knee as if it's happening to them. So we have this kind of mirror neuron component that Girard later on in his career discovered to add evidence to his case. But at the time, they didn't have that kind of research in his purview. He was looking at novels and seeing the kind of mechanistic nature of drama. So we see this all the time. The classic example every mimetic theorist will give you in explaining this is like watching, children in a toddlers in a playroom, and there's an assortment of toys, and one kid picks up one toy, and he was playing with it, kind of lackadaisical, doesn't really care about it, and then the other child wants that toy, right?
Mhm.
And he goes to grab that toy, but the first child didn't really care about the toy, but now he sees his neighbor really wants it, so now he really wants it back, and so he's going to pull it harder, and then you're stuck in that constant rivalry of who's going to get this object. So there's nothing intrinsic about that toy per se that makes it desirable. It's the fact that the model is enjoying it, that the child says, well, if they like it, I should like it.
Right.
And that's the truth of all of your desires, pretty much. I mean, Girard would say at the needs level, for things like surviving, mating, surviving the thunderstorms, you don't need to imitate someone to get out of the way from rain. You just kind of go.
Right.
Food, you don't need to imitate, but you just eat. Of course, mimetic things get layered onto that, right? We get into diets and fashions. So there's a basic need, and then we add these mimetic wants on top of that, where we get into epidemics of eating disorders like bulimia, right, or things like that, where we're competing for these statuses based on diet as a symbol.
Right.
And religions use diet as a mimetic kind of policing measure of, this is who we are and this is who our identity is. And that's one of the reasons why governments do that too, by the way, because they come from religion. So going back to mimetic theory, at the base level, it's this idea that our desires are from outside of us, and that in truth, our self is not really distinct in and of ourselves. It's rather we have multiple selves in relationship with the people we know around us. So there's not just David. There's David in relationship to this person, David in relationship to that person, and that is really where kind of your interdividuality is developed. Your sense of self is basically an amalgamation of all these different relationships that you kind of accumulate in your life, and you kind of create your own kind of narrative to tie it all together to make sense of who you are and differentiate yourself from others. But that line is very much intermingled, really. And this is an affront for people who are, modernists, because we truly believe in being a special snowflake, and that whatever you want to do is truly good, and you follow the heart, you follow the dreams of your heart. And that's, you can't go wrong when you're just true to thyself. Well, who are you? And how do you know that what you want is truly good for you, rather than are you trying to keep up with people around you? So it's keeping up with the Joneses. The Bible condemns this mimetic desire when it goes in a negative way. The 10th commandment says, "Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's this, that, or anything else." But the emphasis is on the neighbor, right? It's not on. It's really, it just kind of basically says, etc., belonging to the neighbor. So the neighbor really is what you're desiring. And really, if you want to get to more of a metaphysical layer to it, it's a desire to be one with your neighbor. If we want to get into the Christian sense of it, we are desiring to be one. And mimetic desire doesn't inherently have to be a negative thing, but it tends to go negative when we don't have it properly ordered, you know, within a proper, in my opinion, a Christian worldview. So that's where you get into negative rivalry. You know, if you go in, if I meet you at a conference, Cam, and at an event, I guess we met before, but if we met again, and you know, and I was rude, and you said, "Hey, man, thanks for coming on my show," and I said, "Yeah," but acting like I'm better or something or rude, you might give me an indication that you saw that with your body language, and you were going to give me a little bit of a, I know what you did there. You're being rude and not nice. And then I'll see that and I'll say, well, see, that's why I'm like that to him, because you see, I've confirmed myself that he's not so nice after all. And so we always make ourselves feel like we're the victim of a mimetic rivalry. You know, I didn't do it. That person's the rude person, you know, and we always, and we always want to make sure that, you know, we're always protecting our sense of self. No, I truly was the one wronged here. And yet it's very hard to recognize that so much of the things that bother us are really a reflection of things about ourselves, and people kind of bring that out in us when we interact with people. So part of being a Christian is learning to be humble enough to recognize that so much of the things that you are enthralled by, the things that you're passionate about, are really things that you've borrowed from other people. And I think the Bible gives us a clue into that when it says, all we like sheep have gone astray, each into our own way. I mean, if you don't recognize you're a sheep, you think you're going to your own way, but you're really not. You're following the sheep in front of you, but you don't know that until you recognize that you are, as a human being, wired like a herd animal for good or bad. It's not a bad thing. We shouldn't be ashamed of it. Mimetic, if you use mimesis properly, it's how you build culture. It's how everything gets done that we enjoy.
Yeah.
I mean, you can't do art, you can't do compositions, you can't do architecture, you can't do language without mimesis. But there was
an interesting part during that interview where he talked about how art and music had kind of stagnated because everybody was in the search of originality instead of being willing to be the disciple or the apprentice of a master, to explore, like a master teaches an original way, and then the students go and explore the depths of that way. We no longer have students exploring the depths of the ways. We are all in this search to be the great original instead of a student. And that's much to our detriment, much to the detriment of our culture, such as it is.
Right.
One exception to this that I've noticed, because I've been reading this book called Children of the Apocalypse by a guy named Justin Marler. And as I'm reading it, there have been several Orthodox icons. And it strikes me as I look at these Orthodox icons, they never learned how to draw a different face. And so I'm not saying that in a bad way, but what I'm saying is there seems to be throughout the centuries a respect for the master, insofar as you can look at any Orthodox icon and it looks almost exactly the same in composition as the one before it. So that is a fascinating exception to that rule. And I thought Jessica might appreciate that.
I do. I study Orthodox iconography, actually. So personally, I actually appreciate that. And I have found because of that devotion to originality, the individuality of each artist shines through more so, because they're in an effort to attain this certain style and cannot help but express their individuality in that attainment. And so I think that is an interesting exception that I had maybe not thought of. Thank you, Cam.
I was sitting there reading it and I was like, these faces all look the same. It's so interesting. How do they look the same from literal, the first century to today? How is that possible? And so I didn't know that would be something to bring up, but there you go. There's my 2 cents.
Well, that's the kids on Twitter call that Lindy, right? Where you're supposed to, there's something that has passed the smell test of history and still keeps itself going, right? And that was because that was an era where that craft was developed and that tradition has been respected before we get into the lie of modernism, where we believe that we are self-created beings that are just, we just are just true founts of desire that should be fully realized in order to find our true bliss. And it's a total lie. And that's why marriages and families and our churches and everything's falling apart because, you know, we're so hungry to be original that we're not willing to just imitate Jesus. So
Mhm.
Yeah.
I've tried to approach people to say, you know, when I do my show, it's not on a religious station, it's not a religious show, but I try to bring Jesus with new eyes into the context of current events to let people see, like, look, you've got the things that Jesus does in the Gospels, the things he does, the sermons on the Mount, those are not like disconnected from his passion, okay, his death, burial, and resurrection.
Right.
That is a survival guide for what you will have to do to survive once what he does on the cross is complete. He's giving you a
Right.
blueprint for how you're going to have to function without having absolute chaos brought onto your society once he reveals the scapegoat mechanism that he does on the cross. And so it's not just a cute little saying that's just tacked on at the beginning, and then there's this terrible story, and they don't want to talk about this. But they, you know, everybody in the liberal order wants to talk about the first part, all the things about being nice and things like that. And you can't separate the two. You know, it's
Mhm.
because the scapegoat mechanism has been destroyed on the cross that you have to really sink or swim in history, or else you're going to be dissolved. You know, that's why he said, "I've come to bring um, peace, but not as the world gives it," right? The peace of the world is founded on a lie. It's founded on murder. It's founded on accusation. And he destroyed that. And progressively through history, this is the most fascinating, one of the most fascinating things about the Girardian work. And I know I'm skipping ahead because I started the foundation and now we're doing some of the more advanced parts of the theory, but it's
Right.
so important for our time to get this stuff out there, is that he, you know, he recognized something about text as a kind, they're like on a trajectory, and media works as a way of kind of like revealing the victims in history, you know?
Mhm.
And it's so important for us to see that now because we can use media intentionally to give a voice to the victim without keeping the cycle of mimetic rivalry going and accusations and finger pointing. Like we can use media in a way that actually is healing and restorative and in keeping of
Yeah.
how the gospel texts themselves function, right? Because the gospel texts are a piece of technology, and which societies get them are able to use that technology for great advantage. And sometimes they use it for bad things, right? Because the gospel technology allows you to step aside from our primitive origins of scapegoating and look for other solutions to tensions and problems that arise in society. And that's why cultures that are steeped with the gospel longer than others comparatively sometimes can have technological advantages which are then used to exploit other people, right? Because they've tasted of the technology of the gospel and they're not willing to fully repent as a society and embrace the true message of the gospel, but rather would use some of the revealed knowledge in the text in a way that gives them an advantage to persecute other people. That's something that humans have been wrestling with all along through history, and we continue to wrestle with it to this day. You know, I mean, that's one of the reasons why America feels this need to go around and occupy all these countries like Afghanistan and
Right.
Ukraine and teach them their version of the gospel. You know, where we're going to put George Floyd murals in Kabul. Like, what the heck is that? What are you doing? This is a distortion of the gospel, right? I mean, they're haunted by their own victims as an empire, but they're going around the world and they're saying, look at, it's kind of like the martyrs or the icons, let's put these martyrs up. See, these are our sacred victims. These are our sacred Christ figures. And you, if you can be like us and learn about LGBTQ and put the flag up in Kabul and everything, you can be like us. You can discover the light. And it's a distorted, mutated form of Christianity that America
Mhm.
is in this revolutionary zeal to spread to everywhere around the globe.
Thanks, Woodrow Wilson.
Yeah.
I think that was one of the most compelling parts of the mimetic theory that I got exposed to during that interview, at least, that there is a tendency in human nature over time. And I think that we in 2022 feel it. There's a tendency toward hostility. And once the common story that we all unite behind, that we all organize behind, doesn't satisfy the majority's need anymore, we do start this cycle of violence. And it was interesting. He talked about Plato sort of like recognizing our tendency toward societal violence, which culminates in the singling out of a single victim to put all of our sins and all of our hostilities and all of our barbarism kind of off onto this person. And then for some reason, peace descends. And there was a recognition by the myth makers that this would happen, but they didn't want that idea to get out. Christ as the anti-myth, that idea compelled me in an I think it's an extraordinary idea that everything around this centers on, that he actually revealed the secret to this cycle. And maybe more now than ever, because we do seem to be like cresting in the hostility aspect of that cycle, is something that people need to hear about, because there was for a time an idea so powerful that it was uniting pretty much the entire world, and the benefit to just like the reduction of poverty, the lessening of violence was like a hockey stick effect. And that concept was Christianity. It shouldn't have happened, and it did. And that's compelling to me, so compelling that it pulled me off of like a secular mindset. So there's something extremely powerful to this idea and the pathway that it's taken through history. Why are we losing it? Why are we throwing it away? Because as Gerard said, you can't criticize Christianity. Excuse me. Sorry, it took me a minute to get that. You can't criticize Christianity against anything else except Christianity. It's the standard by which you're criticizing it against.
Right. Yeah.
So, what are we doing? Are we really like shutting down the engines of the aircraft that we're in? Like in our current culture seems to be like, since the Enlightenment, let's throw Christianity out with the bathwater.
Yeah. We are in the kind of the liberal hegemony of the West is in mimetic rivalry with Jesus, right? It wants to supplant Jesus's personhood revolution with its own fraudulent ripoff that will ultimately end in absolute chaos for everyone. And so again, we had to go back to, all right, so how did we get to scapegoating? We had to go back to that just for a little bit for the audience that's new to this. So we have these desires that we catch among us, and we always want to feel like we're the unique one. That's why when you're a kid, at least for me, everybody wanted to say, I was into Star Wars before you. I was into that anime show before you guys were, and then everybody gets into, I remember there was a phase in middle school, everybody had a skateboard, and everyone had to pick their own favorite skateboard brand as a way of differentiating themselves, right? Like I like Element, or I like World Industries. I couldn't skateboard. I just watched it, right? And I was like, what? I was just the weird guy that couldn't skate. And but I watched these things.
Dude.
Everybody left skateboarding and they went to bikes and BMX bikes, and I'm like, whoa, who started this memo and who was the first one? It was like a magical thing, I don't know who the first one was. Probably the one who had the most mimetic currency amongst the clique of friends or whatever. But that kind of moves, and those are insights into culture. And the thing about adults we are so arrogant and cynical that we want to act like, oh, well, that kid stuff is what kids do. But when we're adults now, everything we do is original. It's like, no, it's not. It's painfully not. So the question is, here's the thing that you have to understand. Why did we have a scapegoat mechanism to bind society together? If we are hyper mimetic, and if it's hard to stop negative mimetic reciprocity, once it starts snowballing, once I start having bad blood with you, it goes and it goes and it goes. Animal Kingdom doesn't have this kind of thing. They have some mimetic patterns, but like an alpha wolf and his competitor, when they fight for dominance over the pack, when the one loses, they surrender their neck, and usually the alpha wolf or whoever won will not take the final strike. There's a dominance and submission.
Yeah.
I lost, you've got it. Okay, we're good. Okay, but that's not how humans are. That when humans have conflict, I kill your friend, you come back and kill my family. Whoever survives from that massacre comes and gets the community together, and we go on a William Wallace-esque, Braveheart, let's kick some ass campaign. And it goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And so the question is like, how are we still here?
Mhm.
Right? How did
Right.
how do we like stop that from going out of control? What's the circuit breaker that shuts that whole insanity of mimetic violence? What contains that, right? And so, you have to think about, okay, if everybody's pointing fingers at everybody else in a time of bad blood, because if you have an antisocial attitude, you can mimetically spread that around your community. If you have a
Mhm.
paranoid, aggressive tone and attitude, that can spread around the community. So as that spreads like a disease, and it's so easy to talk about this now if we've all lived through coronavirus, by the way. This is
Right.
all.
Yeah.
I felt really confused about the corona thing because I was like, I used to explain this mimetic theory like I was talking about this esoteric thing. You had to deeply go back in history. Now you just look around you, and it's so patent. It's like Rene Girard wrote the script. Like God gave him the script. Write the next dramatic issues and try to explain it and try to
Yeah.
explain it. Because it's like I can't. It's almost like not even a theory now. It's like you just see it, and we're in it. But as people have conflict, if you're imitating your neighbor's aggressive energy and finger pointing, you can imagine how it could be easy for that imitational pattern to kind of consolidate around a common threat, right? And you can
Right.
see this happen in various ways. I give the example of like I'm in high school and you see there's a table and there's a conflict and somebody starts pushing somebody else, usually over a girl or something like that, or maybe someone transferred from a rival school that has a conflict with football or something. This is my territory, this is your territory, now you're in my territory, get out. And so there's a
Sure.
conflict that brews, and it starts as a local event, but before you know it, if you're in a certain situation, all the tables and chairs are flying everywhere. You might see that on some of those videos that go viral in Golden Corral or McDonald's. Things start flying everywhere, right?
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
how did this happen? It's like a contagion of aggression, and you can feel it if you ever walk in front of a fight breaking out. Your adrenaline goes up. That's probably your mirror neurons or something. You're becoming mimetically drawn into that state of what it's like for the two combatants. You're becoming, because their adrenaline's up,
Yeah.
and their aggressive energy is up, and their heightened awareness and quick reflex. The closer, if you stand, no one does this, but if you were to stand in front of a very brutal fight as close as you possibly can, you would feel the draw, of being pulled into that energy.
Yeah.
So you can imagine, like in an archaic situation, especially when times are rough, if there's scarcity, if there's a famine, if there's a plague or whatever, that you can imagine that tensions start to brew between two people, and eventually, maybe the rest of the community starts to join one side of that conflict, and
Right.
and they go after that threat and they purge that person and say, yeah, that person was a monster, that person was a trickster, a demon from another tribe coming to trick us and take our women, something like that. That becomes like an accusation that everybody kind of agrees, yeah, that's why that person was different. And the question
Right.
is like, so it can start as a conflict between two and everybody joins that side, or it can kind of start like this person is just different. Like we're walking around and that person, hey, that person looks different. They're too pretty, they're too ugly, they have a deformity. And so here's a clue, like you were talking about what's revealed in mythology, is a lot of mythological gods have handicaps or disabilities. Oedipus Rex had a problem with his foot, right?
Mhm. Mhm.
That's
Mhm.
where you get the name. And
Hephaestus,
what's that?
Hephaestus, or or Vulcan
Right?
had a janky foot.
Or Cyclops with the eye, And then
Right.
you ever see, you get those Drudge Report stories where a goat is born with one eye in some small village in a country, and they parade the thing around and they say they worship it as a god, but it would live for a few hours, a pig or a goat or something. It still happens to this day.
Mhm.
What
Mhm.
about that guy? Like, I remember when I was watching, I don't know if it was like Ripley's Believe It or Not or Guinness World Records or whatever. It's one of those, kind of crappy shows from when I was a kid. And there was a boy that was born with a tail,
Mhm.
Oh yeah.
and he was worshipped.
Mhm.
They thought he was the avatar of whichever the monkey god is in
Mhm.
Hinduism.
Okay.
Like, how does that still happen?
Right.
Like, that's wild.
Yeah.
And you can see how vestiges of that remain even with like circus culture in the hundreds, where people were the bearded woman, the these different things, and they become paraded around, and you have to go and pay money to see it, and there's pomp and circumstance, and there's music, and there's lighting, and there's a little bit of that vestige of that sacred aura around people with differentiation markers that stand out, especially so, right? And so ancient societies were really worried about sameness. They were really worried about people losing their sense of self, because that's where runaway envy, runaway covetousness, runaway conflict brews, and you don't have a society. It's too much bad blood. And so ancient societies create these prohibitions to try to limit moments of undifferentiation. So this is my property, that's yours. Don't go over it, right? I always use the example sometimes of Rand Paul and his neighbor, right? Allegedly, the conflict was over his yard clippings were like over 1 centimeter over the line, right? And that man was losing his mind, that his sense of self, this is me, that's my property. You're Republican, I Democrat. You stay there, I stay there. You're over my line, I'm feeling violated, right? That feeling of undifferentiation drove that man to a maddening moment of violence, right? Where he wanted to, violently go after that sense of slight. So ancient societies, archaic societies are very worried about runaway sameness. So they create these differentiation markers. They create these different hierarchical structures in society to try to mediate those moments of runaway mimetic aggression. But all of those are mediated through what happens originally as a spontaneous event, what you alluded to earlier, of a lynching of a common enemy, right? Earliest archaeological evidence seems to suggest that cannibalism, ritual cannibalism, was a very prevalent thing amongst various societies, right? And
Jessica loved cannibalism.
Yeah, I have a fascination with it because it is so outside of my experience. Why would people do this? Because I feel natural revulsion to the idea of consuming the flesh of another human being. So, at what point was this at least feeling to them like it was conveying a benefit to them? And I think that Girard does kind of interestingly address that issue, which is that, if it's not raining, your crops are dying, your children are dying, and you do this action, and then the next year the rains come and the crops grow and your babies don't die, it stands to reason that eating people causes the fruit to grow larger. So like you do see the logical underpinning, like why a person might think this. Yeah. And so it kind of underlies the human tendency toward violence. That's just like sort of like a secondary example of it.
And think about cannibalism specifically as a type of scapegoating, right? Because not all scapegoating and ritual purgings are going to be cannibalistic, but that is something at the very earliest stages we see a lot of that, of this kind of more direct form of purging, where or eating, really consuming. And you think about that's almost like a hyper mimetic state, right? You're competing with someone, and you're competing with someone. Again, remember the idea of mimesis is oneness with the other. You're literally going to consume the other to be them. And I say it like, if a society is plagued by contagious sameness, they're going to want to consume something that is seemingly other, right? So it's like an antidote. Like, I'm sick with sameness, let me devour that other. And if I devour that other, we collectively are like cured from our pathological sameness. It's a weird look, but it kind of helps you see like why cannibalism. Now, and think about this too. A lot of these cannibal killers you hear about, in these sensational stories that still crop up to this day. You ask them, you ever look at them, and they're always like, they've got this sexual issue with cannibalism, and they have this desire of possession of the other, of consuming, and I wanted to have them, I wanted to consume them, I wanted to be them. So it's this hyper mimesis to this violent, grotesque way, right? So you can see how like society, and there's a good movie I would recommend that helps you see this a little bit, which is The Act of Killing by Joshua Oppenheimer. Have you ever heard of this movie? It's a documentary about the killings in Indonesia. It's a completely beautiful. I don't know if he has any knowledge of Girard, but it's a completely amazing, staggering documentary presentation of kind of these aspects of the sacred that still persist in our more modern times. Because he
Yeah.
goes to these people in the 1960s. There were these people in Indonesia that were in charge of the government that were going around and they were killing ethnic Chinese people and people accused of communism. And they went on all these different killing sprees and so forth, these paramilitary groups. And then those people who did those killings were now in power and they're old and retired. And so what this guy does is he goes to them and he says, hey, can you recreate? Because they're kind of proud of what they did, of their exploits, because the reigning government order has told their stories as if they were heroic acts from their perspective.
Right.
And so what the film, this brilliant movie, he goes and he says, I want you guys to recreate your amazing heroic acts and what you did back then on camera, and I'll help you direct. You'll direct it, and I'll help you film it. I'm from America, we'll make a movie the way you want it. And so these guys were all affected by mafia movies and Western movies. So they add all these weird stylistic elements from American cinema. But these killers go and film and recreate what they did in their killings of these people, right? And one of the things they always said in the movie is they had to drink the blood of their victims to keep their sanity, or else the ghosts of their victims would haunt them, right? So you're seeing in 1960 this kind of psychological vestige of the same primitive cannibalistic. It's like, again, you have to look at media like you're looking at a fossil record, like dinosaurs, and you're looking at transitionary fossils.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. Because you're tracking how human beings like do their collective stuff and then make sense of it, and they report on it in certain ways. And so film is in keeping in that same trajectory of historical texts of persecution and myth making that are covering up victims the farther back in history you go. The closer you go to our time, because of how saturated we are with the gospel revealing the scapegoating violence, the more you'll see it deconstructed and haunting the people who do the scapegoating. So in the movie, I mean, I don't want to spoil it, but basically one of the people that actually comes, they just watch the filming of what they did, exposes their conscience to what they did, and they start to be like repulsed and literally nauseous at to what they actually did once they have to perform it in art. And so that's kind of what I'm talking about when I talk about the gospel technology, is that we can perform the gospel using your show, using whatever, poetry, whatever you do to express this kind of repentance that this guy like makes these people do kind of on accident, because he's trying to document an event, and it ends up like making them literally like vomit out their guilt and their shame.
That interestingly makes me think of those images you see of people who would lynch Black people in the 60s, 30s to 60s, I guess was the era this was happening in. And a lot of these photos, people will be smiling. They're standing around a body that's hanging from a tree, which is, unarguably a grotesque, horrible thing. And they're all smiling. And that has always haunted me. Why are they smiling? Are they just monsters? And people don't do things that they think are evil. They whatever their justifications, they do think it is justified, or else they wouldn't do it. And that's sort of like the secret to all of it, is that they committing these vile actions, these vile acts of violence, in the belief that it is somehow going to bring peace to their community. It's going to make things better.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that I remember hearing, I want to say it was from Elias when we talked to him, but was the fact that a lot of times our reasoning or justification comes after action. Like a lot of times you are caught up in mass hysteria. You are caught up in this mob mentality. I happened to send this to you today, but David, have you ever heard of the meowing nuns?
Mm-mm.
Oh, that's right.
So there were these nuns a long time ago who, one of them started to meow like a cat, and it spread to another nun who started also meowing like a cat.
Yeah.
And then the entire convent over time started meowing like a cat, to the point that a neighboring person, like the I guess the feudal lord or something, actually sent soldiers to tell them, if you don't stop meowing as loudly as you are, we're going to beat you.
Oh.
And
Yeah.
so this is an actual mass hysteria, mass mimetics are a thing even in ridiculous examples. There's another example of a woman who started dancing literally from sunrise to sunset, and then at one point up to 400 people were doing the same thing in the streets to her, so they had to outlaw dancing, which I thought, is this why there are movies like what's the movie with the dancing? Footloose, where there are towns that outlaw dancing. Like, mass hysteria and people copying and imitating others is very well documented, and I find that little fun. I mean, COVID's a great example of this, and I love that there was the counter mimetics of removing the masks. But at this point, we're in Florida, so I mean, like, we had it better than most people. But at the same time, there are these universal human markers of this happening, and it's fascinating. So keep going, keep talking. I just wanted to throw the meowing nuns in there.
It's very fast. I mean, I could talk about this stuff for days. I love it because the thing it's so everywhere, and it makes sense of so many disparate things. Like you were mentioning the lynchings, that was a big thing that impacted Gerard too when he was coming to America. And he's like, "What in the world is going on with these recent events?" And you look at some of those stories, and it's sick. But they were taking tokens from the body, right? Which is kind of, again, you can see that trajectory back in time to cannibalism and like trophies and these things that, like, I've got a piece of this shared sacred victim, right? And why are we killing this person? They're caught up in mass hysteria. Usually it's an accusation, right? You did this, you crossed a boundary of differentiation, remember? So that's this desire to be like, this is who we are, and this is my place in the hierarchy of society. And here we have this pressure cooker of economic turmoil, and I'm very low on the totem pole, but at least I can kick this person below me, right? And if that person comes up and does something that, or is accused of doing something that violates their order on the pecking order, right? Then there will be kind of like a crisis of identity. Well, who am I? If this person supplants me on the hierarchy, then I'm the lowest, and I will be the one who will be most likely to be systemically scapegoated on so many levels, right? So there's this kind of crisis of identity where people who are economically impoverished are going to be prone to giving into this kind of low resolution, violent, sacred violence approach. And I always think of the irony of how horrible it is that, people, there's stories of a black man, and not just one, but being paraded around in a mock king ceremony in a parade before being viciously murdered, right? And I always think to myself, like, this is in America in the 1920s and so forth. It's like, these people went to church. Did they hear the homily, or did they hear the reading of the gospel about Jesus being paraded as a king before he was murdered and sacrificed? Did that not ring a bell? How it but again, looking back in hindsight, it's much easier for us to see these things, but it's much harder for us to see the sacrificial violence that persists in our own time, right? And that's why my child, people are dying from these vaccine injuries, right? Children. And I just heard Peter McCullough, a doctor that I've had on the show multiple times, he said, there's something weird going on. They call it mass formation because Matthias Desmet, the psychologist that got popularized by Robert Malone going on Rogan and talking about it, and McCullough.
Okay.
And so they talked about mass formation psychology. I recently interviewed Matthias Desmet. He's a psychologist talking about a psychological component of what I was showing him in my interview is really rooted in what mimetic theory shows, right? So this is like, this mass formation is a component of the scapegoat mechanism that Girard identified in anthropology. And that just shows there's multiple pathways to the mountain to get to the same conclusion, right? But and Matthias Desmet, by the way, really shared an agreement with me about how Jesus destroys the scapegoat mechanism. That'll be out soon on our show. But where is it going with that? Oh yeah, but the idea is, like, if a child is injured from these experimental products, McCullough was saying it's shocking to me how many these families don't make a big deal about it. They're
Break
like,
a
well,
few
this was,
eggs, as people
this was in
say.
the pursuit of public health. This was in the pursuit of the public good. It was for science. This was cutting edge research. We're doing what we can to survive. We were being good citizens. And so there's your sacrificial logic, right?
Yeah.
Right? Like it had to be done. This is a horrible price that we had to pay, but we must go through with it because of what? This big other, this transcendent big other that we call public health or democracy or the science. This is a big other that functions in the same way that the gods functioned in our more older times, right?
Yeah.
So the question I want you to think about is, well, how does a scapegoat become a god, right? Because if it's vilified, how does it become worship, right? And Gerard says often that the line between adoration and murder is very thin. That gives us one clue, right? But this idea of like, if you come together and you purge or you kill someone who's a common enemy, it creates a relief. It creates tension relief.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And you might say, well, how does it do that? Well, you can think about how that would do that. You're in a time of famine. I don't like you. You don't like me. I think you stole something from my hut. You say, no, I didn't steal it, but I think that you're weird. And I think you've got a weird disease or you're possessed by a demon because I saw you staying up really late, David, and I don't know about you. And there's tensions going around. And then we say, well, hey, I know who the common person is. It's she's a witch or she's cast a spell on the whole community. And we send her out off of a cliff and we say, don't you feel so much better? Wow, that was really intense. Did you see how scary she looked at us? I'm telling you. She had demons. Did you see how she screamed and yelled at us? I mean, goodness. I mean, confirmed everything we believed. Now we're good. Feel relieved. Now you feel that way when Darth Vader. What's that?
I said the scheme wouldn't work though if they knew that the people that they were victimizing were innocent. They have to believe.
Yeah, they have to believe.
The person is evil. That's
why the left has to believe that Trump is the monster of all monsters for them to function, right? They can't just believe he's just another politician. That would ruin their entire sense of purpose and identity. They have to believe he is a villain sent by Russia to destroy civilization and whatever, right? They have to believe in that Grinch to maintain their community.
Yeah. Well, and not to mention, they also are very capable and often use this catharsis, this perceived catharsis, to control people in their feelings. Like, take a look at Harvey Weinstein, or what's his name, Kevin Spacey, Bill Cosby. These are what my friend Monica will call a sacrificial wolf. They take the clearly evil person and they sacrifice that evil person in order for you to feel that the systemic issue is resolved.
Symbolically, symbolically punished. Yeah.
Right. So if Epstein is dead, if Bill Cosby's in prison, if Harvey Weinstein never sees the light of day, then that means the child rape isn't happening anymore.
Right.
They've gotten the guy. And so
if
this
is murdered, everything in Libya is fine,
Right. They use it against us. And I think is the most interesting portion of it. Because I remember, even before I heard of mimetic theory, like I had talked to Monica Perez about that. I was like, I feel like there are certain people like, I think that Harvey Weinstein's a monster and he probably has a weird wiener, like they said in his trial. But like, clearly they want us to see him prosecuted so that we stop asking questions about what Hollywood is doing behind closed doors.
And people know in the establishment forces, they kind of intuitively know how to use mimetic Christian sensibility against the population, right? So they'll come out and say, Bill Gates is being unfairly scapegoated by far right conspiracy theorists. And you're like, and then so because we're so Christian, we're, even if we're not Christian, we're Christianized, like you said, whether you're secular or not, you're swimming in Jesus's fishbowl of moral wiring, kind of. And so they know how to prey on that. And that's how the establishment keeps its power going. Is it's always like, don't scapegoat Mr. Tony Fauci, this poor old man, make him out to be the problem. He caused everything. I mean, you guys are just villainous scapegoaters. And so because we're so Christian, we don't want to be associated with scapegoating. So they use that narrative machine and media to keep kind of like, well, don't you dare, so that keeps some of the justice from ever taking place, because they can always say, well, you're kind of scapegoating them, aren't you? And you're like, no, I would never do that. I'm a very nice, sensible, modern, sophisticated person. I would never scapegoat anybody. I mean, that's what the primitive Trumpsters do, right? Or whatever. That's what those irredeemable deplorables. That's why if you ever watch like Twitter, whenever there's a Trump rally, just read what they say. Oh, they're missing teeth. They're stinky. They're dirty. You know, that's the same thing, really, psychologically going on in the Old South with those terrible attacks against African American people. It's like, I want to make sure that someone is lower than me on the hierarchy of power, right? And so that's what the left. That's why the left's obsessed with like hating and spreading so much blame on the people. It's not about Trump, really. It's about what he represents, right? He's trying to humanize a designated scapegoat class that the establishment has said you are free to punch on, you're free to mock, you're free to talk about their poverty, you're free to talk about their teeth being gone, you're free to talk about being inbred, you're free to say everything you want. You can punch on them, it's okay. Beat on them, beat, it's okay. That's your scapegoat. And then that class says, no, you guys are the criminals. No, you know, so that the says, no, you guys are scapegoating. No, you guys are doing this. And they're all there's always little bits of truth in a lot of this, right? This is mimetic rivalry. You get in the midst of it and it looks like an undifferentiated mob of the same, you know, it's like Looney Tunes, I say, you know, where they're fighting and then Bugs Bunny comes out and they're still fighting behind him. And he's like, what is going on here? It's just mindless, you know, undifferentiated violence. I mean, Looney Tunes is way more rigorous philosophically than most of the stuff you'll learn in philosophy class at your local university today. Just watch it and enjoy with mimetic theory in the mind. But yeah, I mean, it's I don't know where we were going with that, but
well, I think
will
they do that
say
with
you're.
Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say I will say that your example of the Old South and Black people is particularly apt because I think that they did scapegoat Black people because they were mad at the federal government. They were mad at the North for what the North did to them, for what poverty they put them through with, you know, carpetbagging, with Reconstruction, with all of these things. And I think that if you look at the historical record, I don't think, I think that Black people were scapegoats and in a big way. So that's fascinating to me. I appreciate you bringing that up.
And you can look. That's why to understand the left, you have to understand that they get their power by, and again, we keep skipping ahead because we haven't really explained to the audience how Christianity precisely makes power what it is. But if you look at what the left's doing, they're basically getting their power from what I call like martyrs energy, you know, because they come along the side of historical injustices and victims and they say, look at this. And so they're taking it's a kind of cruciform power. They're taking the cross and they're wielding it for political power. Girard calls it victimism, where you use the concern for victims to gain power and status and influence, right? The left does that better than the right every day. Most of the days, they just do it better.
It's a cruciform perversion as well. Because I mean, look at Revelation. If you read into Revelation, you see this image that John sees of that there's the seals that need to be opened. And in those seals, the only person who can open them is the strongest among them. And so he hears, here comes the Lion of the tribe of Judah. But when he looks, he doesn't see a lion, he sees a slain lamb. And then you see later on in the battle that Jesus comes to the battle already bloody. And so in this way, Jesus shows us that the way to defeat our enemies, the way to defeat evil, defeat death, is through sacrificial giving of your own life. It's through not harming people. And so these people take the martyrs, they take the victims, and they justify their violence with them. And that's so, like I said, it's a perverse cruciform symbol. And
that's why
that's interesting.
Girard called that the Antichrist, because it takes on the form of the cross. It takes on the form of the defense of the victims. Remember, Holy Spirit means paraclete, and paraclete means the defense attorney, right? And so you've got the accuser is where we get Satan from, the accuser. So it's like special prosecutor versus the defense attorney, and it's fighting in a courtroom battle over whether to allow this victim to be, scapegoated and condemned, or to give mercy and save the victim. So there's kind of a courtroom drama there between what Satan does and the principalities and the kingdoms of this world, and what the defender does, the Holy Spirit community. And when Zizek is right, Zizek, he always talks about like the cross is the death of the big other. And he talks about it kills this kind of like big other, this certain transcendence that we can appeal to. And because Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? And it's like, he says the true atheism is in that cross moment, right? But the absence of this certainty of this transcendent big other. And that's another way of looking at what Girard talks about, which is that that Jesus' story destroys the unanimity and the catharsis of the scapegoat mechanism, what Zizek calls the dethronement of the big other, and is actually another way of looking at the scapegoat mechanism and its concealment of violence, its maintenance of society, its unanimity. That's so important. The unanimity of violence is what's necessary for society to function in that pre-Christian way, right? Is that we all come together and we say, this is what needs to be done because this person is wrong. Now, so when you have that original spontaneous lynching and that murder in the primitive sense, people remember that. They remember that we were at each other's throats, must have been a spell, must have been a famine, must have been something. And our ancestors did this. They did X, Y, and Z, and that resolved the problem. So it's kind of like a recipe that is socially remembered through the generations. Right. And as it's repeated, it becomes more intentional. Where at first it was a spontaneous thing, it now becomes more of a codified ritual thing, right? Where you're remembering something in an intentional way. And that's why all the societies have ritual sacrifice at the roots, right? It's because that's an attempt to kind of recreate, like going to a Civil War reenactment, but in a more real way. You're trying to recreate the moment that created order in a time of chaos that your ancestors did.
Have you ever read The Lottery by Shirley Jackson?
Yeah. It's
This is bringing this to mind because it is mimetic theory in what 12-page short story.
Yeah.
So read that, because that's it in action. What he just talked about.
That was like a fine reading in public school, and little did they know that it was revealing public school to the kids reading it. They just didn't see it at the time. You could only know ahead of time what we were reading.
I think it is interesting to know that a lot of this is a response to a pre-Christian world, and when it's criticized for not solving every problem of violence in our current society, so they're judging it by the very standard of Christianity. And saying, oh, well, this, according to the standards of Christianity didn't fix everything. Sort of like you're not taking into account that this is all a response to a world where none of these ethics existed before that.
I mean, like, Christianity basically invented children as a thing, right? As like, ironically, as not a thing, right? So they, Christianity is what put children in a special status to protect. Where in the Roman world, they were being used.
And women.
And the band. Women.
That's what I was going to say, was like, I was not considered a person until that revolution. This is something that Cam and I have talked about in previous times on the show, that Christianity was the first ancient world human rights movement, and definitely a women's rights movement, as compared to the Greek and Roman worlds, where women were chattel. They were there as a necessary part of nature for reproduction. And really kind of seen as like anti-manly, and therefore like the epitome of everything you didn't want to be.
And if I remember correctly, we talked earlier, you and I and a friend, about the current zeitgeist, where we are right now. And it reminded me, because we were kind of talking about how what is not masculine is being shoved into the box of being a woman at this point. So there's a lot of that shifting. And it reminded me of the fact that I want to say it was Greek culture, women weren't considered to be separate, but they were deformed men.
Right.
And so I just wanted to throw that out there, that it's an interesting thing that Christianity in particular really, even earlier than Christianity, when it was Judaism, really pushed the idea that women were equal to men, if not the same. Because sameness and equality are two different things, by the way.
Correct. And so now you have a society informed by Christian ethics turning around and saying Christians are so repressive of women. And I'm like, you wouldn't even know how to read right now if it weren't for Christianity. Like that,
Right.
every woman in this country that knows how to read, you can thank Christian ethics for your
It's
ability
like even
to
the both sides of the abortion debate are Christian arguments, really. They're just different.
Yep.
You see what I mean? Like
Right.
the idea of a woman should have the consent to determine if they want someone in their, living in their body and growing in their body, the baby, right? So
Mhm.
there's the sacredness of the will, right? This idea of like my agency is sacred. That's Christianity, right?
Yeah.
Christianity is the one that says that Mary voluntarily agrees with God, bringing this child. All other myths, whenever there's a god interacting with a woman, it's violent and rape. This is the only story in which consent is at the heart of the situation.
Correct.
It's a total. We have no clue how revolutionary this would be for the world in which this text comes. We have no
Right.
idea. I mean, going back to Joseph, right? Radical ancient BC story that's saying at the time that Oedipus is being written or developed, this idea of Oedipus where, there's this problem, there's a plague. Oedipus says, yeah, turns out I agree with the accusations that I killed my dad and, I did all this stuff. I slept with my mother. Therefore, I'm guilty. And he blots out his eyes and he leaves the community and Thebes is restored, right?
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
That is a preservation of the scapegoat mechanism in a more direct, because the playwrights were more in tune with giving a little bit more truth to the process of myth, so that when you see it play like Oedipus Rex, it kind of reveals the sausage making of the mythic concealment of victims a little more than like an ancient, more primitive myth. If you go back into earliest myths, like creation myths, they start with chaos.
Yeah.
So how did the chaos get there? If this is the beginning, if this myth is about really truly like a scientific report about the beginning of material world, why does it start with chaos? It's because it's talking about how they actually resolved a primordial moment of chaos socially. And then out of this murder, Marduk, I'm just making up, Marduk falls and his head opens up and out comes this tribe and out comes the waters. And it's like all this differentiation. Here is this, here is us, here are you. It's all this orderly stuff out of some cartoonish act of violence. And we read that because we are still mythically concealed in our own modern myths. And we say, oh, how cute. They're just trying to come up with creative expressions. That's what you learn in mythology class and humanities. Look at this wonderful little cartoony little thing. And what does this tell us about the seasons? And what does this tell? And that's where you get into kind of the young stuff where it's like, oh, the archetypes. And that's all great. But you're not looking at what's really going on, because Girard would say you need to apply the same skepticism you have to more recent texts of history where persecution is shown. You need to apply that same hermeneutical suspicion to ancient myth. That's all he's doing. You want to get to a shorthand of what I'm talking about with Girard for like understanding myth, is just apply the same skeptical hermeneutic that you apply to a text in the Middle Ages where they say there was a plague and they said the Jews did it. They threw the Jews down the well and the plague went away. When we read that text, we know, okay, that's not true. That they didn't do that. The Jews didn't do that. They're being accused of something that's magical. Or you read the story of the witches. Oh, there was this death and we killed the witch. She said she was guilty. Yeah, she said she's guilty because you wrote the report or she was coerced, right? But you got your guilty victim. So now you can write it off in the stories as guilty. And they believe it, right? A lot of them believe it. And then we read that text and we're like, oh, how dare those Christian patriarchal people, but it's like the reason why you can see the hypocrisy is because the way in which it's reported is more gritty. It's more realistic. So you can see if they had a story in the Salem era that said there was this God and he breathed fire and we came along and there was a rain and we were all going to drown. And one day we decided to let that God fly off of a cliff. And ever since that day, on that day, we commemorate how that God flew off into the heavens and stopped the torrential rains. first of all, we wouldn't recognize a text like that, as like we were like, what is that, a fantasy story someone wrote in the 1600s? What is that? But like
Right.
we wouldn't recognize that. But that's how primitive, archaic mythology is, right? And we give that a pass. We don't say there's any concealment of violence there. We're just like, oh, that's just artsy expression. No,
Yeah.
the reason why we do that is because we're trying to avert our gaze from the truth of human violence. You see, we are more likely to see the violence and hypocrisy in a more recent event when it's a Christian context, right? Because then we can say, hey, it's like killing the messenger, right? It's
Yeah.
like the very thing that allows that text to be more realistic in its portrayal of violence so that we can read it and be like, no, that's obvious BS. The winners are writing the history. That's not true. Those witches do not do that. They're not witches. They're innocent. This is a sham. And we read that as propaganda. And the same thing we can go in more recent history, I mean, we see this all the time in media today. Oh, that's not true. That's not what Trump said, or that's not what happened in that. That's not what happened there. When Hillary Clinton said, we came, we saw, he died. Ah, ha, ha, ha. We're like, no, that's not true. We saw the video. That's a sham thing. You unleashed slavery. That wasn't a good thing. Right. So media allows us today to see different perspectives the same way that the gospel text did in accounting for Jesus's death from the victim's perspective. So important, showing the victim's perspective. So when you see Gaddafi, as brutal of a man he was, being butchered, that's a gospel technology, because you're like, wait a second, this isn't right, right?
Right. Right.
It's wicked, like this is not right. This is mob violence. That woman's laughing about that on CBS. She is not a model for young women to imitate. This is really sick, right? So your conscience, the gospel is like a type of doing technology, whether it's a camera watching Gaddafi or a photograph of Emmett Till, right?
Yeah.
That's a type of technology that opens up a space of learning for society to then evolve away from that era's form of sacred violence. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no,
Yes.
and you bring up primitive and pagan gods, and I find it fascinating because if you like my particular interest when it comes to reading about mythology has been Norse. And what I love about the gospel does it. The gospels do it, absolutely. But it preceded that even in the Genesis account of creation, because those accounts fly in the face of every other creation myth in the most fascinating ways. Like if you look at, like I said, Norse mythology, Odin, Vili, and Ve destroyed the giant Ymir and created the world through using his blood, his skull, his hair, etc. And Marduk is a great example as well. And that's actually the contextual adversary of the Genesis narrative.
Yeah.
Right.
And I love it so much because you do have the chaos, you do have it, but you don't have the violence that necessitated the creation of the world it's all the gospel, to be honest. It's all the good news. But you don't have that in Genesis. You have a God who created ex nihilo in a sense, but I love digging into ancient cosmology because I get to exit the mind of a rationalistic 21st century man and look at how they understood the world and how they understood creation, because creation wasn't in the sense of, oh, well, science says that this happened, and it's not materialist. It's about classification in some sense. It's about usefulness. It's about utility. It's about how God named things, and thus they found their identity. And it's a polemic in a sense against the pagan cultures of the time. And I adore that so much.
Yeah.
And I just had to throw that in there because I mean, you mentioned Joseph, but you didn't get to really expound upon that yet. But
Joseph. Yeah, Joseph.
Joseph
he's thrown into a ditch, and then the radical thing about the gospel and that story is the camera goes down with him into the ditch.
Yeah, and he becomes the hero.
Walk around and they say, if I was in the day of my ancestors, we would not have done what all these injustices. These modernist liberal, and us too, because we're all liberal to some degree. We're all in this kind of hubristic superiority complex about it. Well, that's why we have 1619 Project. We got to go back and flagellate past generations as if we are standing above history, right? As we, freaking send people to all kinds of gruesome sacrificial violence every day. I mean, they elected a guy like Biden who spent half a century locking up people in vulnerable communities for profit and power and throwing away the key and sending them into assault cages where there's no way of defending themselves from brutal violence, right? And they voted for that guy feeling as if they were cathartically defeating the dragon who was somehow stopping racial justice and things from happening. Right. But stupid myth just like kept it going, right? But that's the illusion, that's the fantasy of myth making in real time. And the news media is the kind of continuation of the priestly caste that would tell the scribal traditions of, right, why are we doing this sacrifice again? The gods did this, and in the beginning there was this, and that bloodshed is what allowed us to have this, and differences and order and things like that. And so we have to keep doing the same sacrifice. That's what the news media is kind of functioning as. So when people say, I wish the media would get back to the good old days when they're objective news, I'm like, those are blips on the radar because of Christianity creating a subversive prophetic critique in news media. That was the exception to the rule. Media has always been mediators, the priestly caste. They've always been telling the populace.
Yeah.
Oh.
He blipped out, but no, that's the concept of the cathedral. That's the concept of the.
Why?
I mean, all right, you're back.
Yeah, you're saying that's the concept of the cathedral, which is a very appropriate term for this. We're dealing so when Jesus, I mean, there's so many stories you can show in the Old Testament. I mean, you can go right to the first story where Cain kills Abel, and he found on his bloodshed, he founds the first city. So there's your state right there. There's your first polis, right? It's founded by bloodshed. It's founded by a desire for the other, right? This other person got a status that I wanted, and I killed them, and that other.
Lamech.
What's that?
And Lamech, you follow that up with the story in Genesis of Lamech, who killed another man and said, I'm 7 times what Cain was.
Right.
Like it builds upon itself. That is mimetic in and of itself. I want to be like Cain, who created this city. And so now I have Canaan, who is the traditional enemy of Judaism.
And what's interesting about the text is that a lot of Girard fans who go into theology and stuff, they point out that some of those texts look like they're taking on the voice of myth, right? And so there's an argument within some Girard fans, and even Rene Girard would say he changed a little bit on some of the things in his later years, but there's this idea that I'm comfortable with, which is the idea that the Bible is a text in travail, where there's an argument happening between like the priestly voices and the prophetic voices, right? You have some voices saying, God demands the sacrifice, and then you have another one saying, no, when I brought you out of Egypt, I did not demand the blood of bulls and goats and so forth. And so you're like, what's going on here? So there's a dialogue happening within the text itself, and you say, is that a flaw? And it's like, no, actually, it's a feature, because what it's allowing us to do is to be able to be in dialogue and wrestle with this tension of some stories having kind of a little bit more of that mythological approach, and then other stories having the revelation of the victim. And how could you have done that? If they had told the full revelation without any of the context of the world perspective as it was progressively evolving, then it would be a revelation. It would be another revolutionary moment that would end in violence. It's precisely because the Bible preserves a kind of an anthology of texts of human beings grappling in the dark with what God wants of us. And that dialogue of kind of getting it right, but then sometimes falling back into the voice of the persecutor, but then going back to the voice of the victim, and allowing that to be in dialogue is what allowed a society to, like the Israelites, to develop and remember what it's like to be persecuted. If they had what I'm trying to say is, like, all revolutionary moments try to just throw out, right? It's out with the old, we're starting a new culture, no sacrifice. That is a violent thing. It ends in violence, right? Because you're not showing, you're not giving space for growth and like maturation. And so the Bible is so nonviolent that it won't violently break up the sacrificial order in its text. So that's why you have animal sacrifice. That's why you have these things that are kind of like weaning humanity, like you need the scapegoat. So let's do animals, not humans. Let's start with that, okay? You need to kill something to vent your sins and your pains and your miseries and your jealousies and all of that. Okay, let's do an animal. Okay, so that's what the story of Abraham, in my opinion, is. The text, the narrator is changing, which is a type of art. We know that there's unreliable narrators in good literature. The Bible's a greatest literature of all. So they're going to have a narrator that says, hey, go kill your child. And we look at that and we're like, as modernists, we're like, oh my goodness, what a horrible thing. In that context, that was like, okay, that's what gods do. They demand your child sacrifice. What this Moloch? Okay, same old, let's go do it. And then the text changes. Oh, okay, don't do the child, do the animal. That's the evolutionary thing, right? The go kill your child thing. We look at that 2,000 years infected with Christianity. We're like, oh, the horror, what a terrible thing. What a horrible burden that would be. But for Abraham, it was just like, of course, it's a terrible thing, probably he felt. But societally, that's kind of the way gods did their deal, you know?
Yeah.
Demand sacrifice of their firstborn. That's why the story of the story of what is it? The Jericho, where it says this city is founded with the cost of your firstborn, right? It's kind of showing you like this is the way societies are going to be like founded within your order, and God is going to work with people in their false creation of a sacred in their own image, and he's going to work with people to slowly like operate from their language and point them back to his true transcendence, to get them out of the false transcendence that for a time had kept society kind of functioning in a way. But he's going to try to say, okay, that's why we've got to stop that slowly. That's why you have the Old Testament leading the prophetic tradition to Jesus, so that there's this process of maturation where a people can understand what it's like to be persecuted, what it's like to be a loser, what it's like to be defeated, and to write their story in that context, right? Because they're writing in captivity. Only a people that writes and remembers who they are in captivity could even be able to even prepare the way for the scapegoat, not as a nation, but as a person now, right? So a nation is scapegoated. This people, they're scapegoated by different empires here and there. And then from that nation of scapegoats, the true scapegoat of human history comes in, and he's scapegoated by that nation, right? And then through that scapegoating, he creates this new world order in which wherever that story goes, people start to see history from the perspective of the victim, of the so-called losers, the scapegoat crisis. And now that starts to infect, and it starts to destroy from within the well-oiled machine of sacrificial violence.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things that I've come to the conclusion to in recent days, looking at all of these different stories. I mean, like you'll hear theologians describe the New Testament and what Jesus did as instituting the upside down kingdom. But if you go from Genesis to Revelation, you see that the Bible, in a sense, is one giant polemic against the violence of the world. It goes against these ideas and these destructive things that we do, and it's progressive, not in the sense of what Woodrow Wilson brought to us with his social gospel, with what we have today with our wars of bringing democracy to people who don't want it, but progressive in the sense that it actually is progressing through time, and God knew where we were and where we could be, and created these stories and this oral tradition that became written tradition that we're able to access today and go, okay, so my what I perceive as my nature, which is corrupt rather than my actual nature, desires violence. It desires destruction. It desires peace through way of war, when in fact, at the end of the day, God wants peace by way of peace. And I find that beautiful, and I just had to mention that, because it's the Bible as a polemic. I could write that book. Maybe I will someday.
It's a very empathetic polemic too, because that's why it doesn't throw out the perspective of this sacrificial logic that runs through the story. It's because there's a tension here. It's a process of being aware of what we're doing and getting the false transcendence that we created as a kind of stopgap to prevent runaway violence, and starting to realize, wait a second, there's another way. There will be blood, but the question is, are we willing to sacrifice another, or willing to self-sacrifice, right?
Mm.
And that's what Jesus brings to the table is, okay, now it's time to learn how to self-sacrifice. Not necessarily that you always literally have to die, but that you have to die to the self, die to the right to yourself, right? That I have a right to be comfortable and I don't have to be, and that's why I want those drug dealers to be in a cage, because I'm scared about what they're going to do if we allow drugs to go around in society. And so that you have to sacrifice that part of yourself, that fear of the other, rather than to sacrifice the other, because by sacrificing the other, you perpetuate the violence and the drug war, and it gets worse and worse and worse, right? So that's operating under the kingdom of Satan. That's what Jesus talks about when he talks about Satan casting out Satan. Satan exists by chaos, and then by consolidating that chaos onto a common victim, and that Satan is then cast out to resolve the original satanic chaos that started. And that's the process that all kingdoms operate under. That's why Satan offers Jesus the kingdoms of the world. He's like, okay, this is how I do it. All you have to do is imitate me, and you can have the kingdoms of the world. And what he's going through is a psychological temptation to be William Wallace there.
Yeah.
He's basically like, you've got a movement on your hands, Jesus. Just do a little bit of violence. Let's make this Robin Hood. Let's take, he's trying to appeal to Jesus' sensibilities, saying, look, you've got a movement coming. You've got all this injustices. The people are on your side. Let's do a little William Wallace Braveheart action here. Just do it like I would do. And traditionally, the place in which he takes them in that mountain scene overlooks. I was in Jericho, the ancient Jericho town, where they had the heart of the city in the original tell that they had there, and there was a sacrificial temple there. And they're like, there's a sacrificial temple.
Isn't it also inside of Mount Hermon?
What is this? The Temptation Mountain?
Yeah.
It may be. I don't know. I don't remember the name. But I remember that the guy that I was with, he was like, okay, this is the Jericho city center. This is where they would do sacrifices. And so I'm thinking like, okay, Jericho, that means moon god. So this is like moon god city. This is how we keep the moon on. This is how we keep the lights on, is we got to sacrifice humans and animals and so forth.
Right.
And then he says in passing, and it wasn't part of Jericho. It was just like, oh yeah, over there, that mountain is traditionally known as the Mount of Temptation, where Jesus was taken up by Satan. I'm like, oh, so he would have seen the cityscape, but he would have seen the biggest tower that I'm standing next to, where sacrifices were done. And Jesus and Satan's like, this is how it's done, Jesus. Come on. You want to be a king? You want to be like Bernie Sanders? You want to lead the 99 against the one? Whatever it is, you got to spill a little blood there. Come on now. Yeah. And that's what Peter does to him too. He's like, don't let it be said that you would die on the cross, dude. Come on. So that's why he says, get behind me, Satan, because the spirit of temptation, of political violence, has been brought back into the question with Peter there.
Sorry, Cam. We recently had an episode where we talked about the willingness of Christians to do violence on their enemies. Just seems to be this like current that we've been seeing lately, where it's like these special people are selected, and it's okay to do violence on them because it's for the greater good. It's for, all of the reasons we just went through. And for some reason, it's just like this, we have chosen these people to surpass the command of Christ to love your enemy. And how do we, like, at modern corporate Christianity, how did they square this against the actual teachings of the teacher?
Yeah. One of the things, like Mount Hermon, which I believe is the mountain that those sacrifices were done on. And I have another point about sacrifices in a second, so remind me if I forget. I'm too ADHD to do all this. But you have this statement to Peter about, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell can't prevail against it. One of the best things I ever did was I stepped back from reading that verse, and I read what was there, because in my mind, as I read, the gates of hell won't prevail against it, I read that as offensive, that the gates of hell. But what are gates? What are we talking about here? Gates are defensive by nature. So in this conversation about the gates of hell, this is a defensive mechanism, and Jesus wasn't saying that we will fight their onslaught. He's saying we will take their city. We will take what they believe is theirs. And so I just wanted to say that. But also your point about Jericho is interesting, because if you look at the actual Greek of the New Testament, the word that is, so there are a couple of words, Sheol, Hades, and Gehenna, that are translated as hell, which I think is incredibly imprecise and should be fixed in some of these translations. But Gehenna is especially interesting because a lot of people will tell you that Gehenna was a garbage dump, and that's what Jerusalem used it for, or whatever. But in reality, if you look at Jeremiah, Isaiah, you have the conversation about Gehenna, which means the Valley of Hinnom, which was used as a place of Moloch worship and Moloch sacrifice, which was child sacrifice. And so this was a place that was desecrated. This is a place that was made detestable. And so this idea of child sacrifice, of human sacrifice, of this catharsis of scapegoating into children became what we see as the concept of hell. That is where those, if you look at Isaiah, those who rebelled, those who did these things are killed and rot and are destroyed. And it's just the idea of Jericho plays so well with Jesus's concept of Gehenna. And I just wanted to throw that out there.
Well, that's kind of why I think Jesus warned about Gehenna, because he was telling, the people who were under occupation by Rome and corrupt leadership of their own, that, like if you continually keep this attitude of sacrificial violence to like get vengeance back on, God's going to get our people, he's going to get our enemies, and we're going to get and you don't clean house in your own heart, right? And you just want to keep getting, you want to get that vengeance, you're going to end up getting Gehenna. And Josephus says they did, right? So in 70 AD with the rebellion, they're being thrown into the valley of Gehenna, so that's kind of like perpetuating the child sacrifice thing. Like people are being sacrificed because instead of following the way of peace and nonviolence that Jesus offered you, you chose the path of reciprocating, mimetically imitating the violence and ugliness of your persecutors. And then all it did was just create more sacrifice of your own, of your children, just like child sacrifice. And it literally happens in 70 AD. So that's what he's just warning them. You're going to, beget more violence. It's not going to solve your problems. It's going to make it worse. And that's why his way had to go through what he did by, okay, now I'm going to have to show you the sausage making of sacrificial logic. And it's this perfect culmination of both like the Jewish way of sacrificing that was happening. They didn't do human sacrifice like the pagans did, like Rome did, but they did still sacrifice in their own way, right? I mean, because there's a difference between like stoning the woman accused of adultery is a kind of sacrificial violence, right? But it's not the same as human sacrifice like the Aztecs were doing, right? But the Jews were still doing some of that, even though they weren't. Their prophetic tradition had cleaned up so much of that human sacrifice relative to other cultures that were still more concealed by mythic violence, that they weren't doing human sacrifice like that, but they were still doing human sacrifice in other ways, right? And so that's why Jesus is like trying to like see that like what you see with the wickedness of Rome is really, you're still doing that under your own way. And you are killing the prophets, and you're still killing the prophets. You're not better than your fathers. You're not the good guys here. You've got to recognize the blind spot that you have here. And that's why that story brings the Jewish story and this universal pagan impulse of sacrificial violence. It brings them together, right? And then it births something new that is revelation, where you can now harmonize both the tradition of the Jews and the pagan world. And that's why Christianity has been so attractive to tribal societies that encounter it, because they intuitively get, oh, okay, so that's why we were doing that sacrifice stuff. They get it because they're much more in tune to the visceral reality of sacrifice as a way of binding a community together than us modernists who hide our sacrifices into mandates and laws and taxes and all these bureaucratic supposedly non-religious forms of behavior. The people who are still more in these indigenous communities are like, oh, so when they hear the story of Jesus, that's why they're like, they intuitively get it. I get it. So that's what this is for. This is the end of sacrifice. I don't need to sacrifice anymore. And that's why the first things they do is put away their sacrificial rituals when they encounter the gospel.
Right. And not to mention that even in that, the fact that Jesus assented to his sacrifice is radically different than the rest.
Right. And that's
radically
why
different.
And that's why there's like when we do Memorial Day and we talk about people laying down their lives for the nation, there's a kind of Christian form there, and there's also the pagan form there, right? Because the Christian form is like you lay down your life not in the process of killing somebody else. That Jesus doesn't kill. He doesn't lay down his life going out with a suicide mission to take out his tormentors. He lays down his life voluntarily and doesn't take anybody with him. And yet today, our nation, I think there is something Christ-like with someone saying, you know what, it's World War II and I've got to, defend my nation from these horrible people. In that way, there's a kind of Christian self-sacrifice to it, but it's not in its fullest sense, right? It's not fully Christian. It's still missing the mark in some sense. Now, if you're drafted in something, now that becomes even more Christian because it's like it's not your choice. You've been assigned to this death and you're going to do what you can to survive and protect those around you. That question of war is a very interesting thing because the way we look at war is steeped with Christian influence to that story that humanizes the soldier and honors the soldier and also recognizes kind of how the soldier's being used as a vessel of sacrifice for the nation's body. That's why they tie your right to vote is tied to they shed their blood for your right to vote. So the preservation of the nation's body is contingent upon like you have to participate in this ritual that elects the ceremonial heads of this national body because people shed their body so that national body would survive, right? So there's a very religious transference, a substitution taking place there. This atonement thing is happening in a national sense, right? And so when you see like folk Christianity put those images together, I stand for the flag and I kneel for the cross and Jesus saves my soul and the soldier saves my nation. These kind of like, there's a perversion of Christianity there, but there's also, if we're going to be Christians, we have to recognize there is something Christian there too, right? Does that make sense? Because we don't want to be like the iconoclasts that throw things down and say, I am a social justice warrior and I will stand on top and say that, we have to understand that there's the continuity here as well as a breaking point, right? And that is important because we have to be able to meet people where they're at. We can't just go in there and say, oh, your wars are wicked and you're a killer and you're a murderer. And it's like, that's not how the Bible does it. The Bible has this conversation between, do we sacrifice and do we go to war and what do we do when we're occupied? And, there's a conversation going on, right? And there's a lot of paradox in the Bible. There's a lot of tension that's left for you to wrestle with yourself. I mean, the name Israel is wrestle with God. So it's like, that's kind of the point is like, you've got to wrestle with it. If it's all a flat text with no dialogue and tension within the different narrations, how's there any wrestling? You just submit. Right. That's Allah. That's another religion. We're dealing with wrestling here. We're not dealing with just, dominant submission. That's another story. We're dealing with wrestle with it. That's a different story. And that's what we're working on right now. We're wrestling with it as a society.
Yeah, that's something that I've said in the past is that, if you're not wrestling with God, you're not doing the work. And you need to do the work. You need to do the work. One of the things that I want to say, though, is I would say that if you were going to find an American soldier who was the most Christ-like that I can think of, it's got to be Desmond Doss.
Yeah.
What an have you watched Hacksaw Ridge?
Yeah, that's a really good movie. Yeah.
I cannot recommend Hacksaw Ridge more. What's funny about Hacksaw, we talked about this with, I think, Elias a couple of weeks ago. But the beauty of Hacksaw Ridge is that they had to remove certain elements from the movie because even though they happened, they were too unbelievable for the audience to take.
Wow.
Yeah.
Like this is a man who was a pacifist who went to war to protect and help and be the medic of the people who got hurt, regardless of what side they were on.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That is Christ-like.
It's interesting to look at Mel Gibson's body of work and to see him like become more and more, he's wrestling with violence or Christ-like love. And you see it kind of in a trajectory in some of his works. Like you look at Braveheart and it's more of the classical, you know, we've been hurt, we've been oppressed, and it's time for us to get revenge, which is, there's an attractiveness to that. I mean, we're not above that. We feel that. I mean, we don't know what it's like to be in that context. Like we live in a different way, most of us, in terms of that deep level of brutality that people can be subjugated to in history.
I think that's why they talk about forcing a peaceful man to draw his sword, because when that happens, the sort of violence that gets unleashed is like 10 times anything that a common brute could ever hope to achieve.
Yeah. Like, or like Doctor Who said, demons run when a good man goes to war.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I think that's
and there's
wonderful sentence.
There's something to be said for that. That violent nature can be at times necessary to protect innocent life, and so we do see this. Yeah. We do see this like sort of righteous fury, and we respect it, and we want to emulate that and make that part of like what we're imitating.
You know,
we always believe. Go ahead.
If someone picks up their arms and they go off because they're worried Japan or Nazis are going to invade them, I mean, you can talk about the, you know, the counter history of, you know, FDR knew it was going to happen and all that, but that's not what the person in the moment is knowing. They're doing what they can to defend their country from being, you know, harmed. And so there's nothing, it's, you know, we can't condemn these things, right? There's a self-defense that I think, I'm not a pacifist. I believe in nonviolence, but I think nonviolence is different from pacifism, right? And my understanding of nonviolence from a Christian perspective, that would mean no aggression and no vengeance, but there's a place for defense. Of course, that's a tricky thing because everybody justifies their aggression by saying they were doing it in defense. So it kind of leaves it in this kind of complex area, right? But
the scapegoat formula doesn't work if you believe that the scapegoat is innocent. You cannot function that way. Our brains don't work that way.
And we fetishize violence. Mm-hmm. Like let's not go past the modern or postmodern concept. Like we watch Braveheart for catharsis.
Right.
We watch The Patriot for catharsis.
Right. And he's showing some of the victims' perspective by showing the deep pain of William Wallace being tortured. So he's doing some gospel there, right? Because he's showing the pain of the victim. Incidentally, that, you know, the history of that thing, they put his limbs and stuff surrounding the city of London, you know?
Yeah, he was hanging, drawn, and quartered.
Which again, I'm trying to show you that's you can see the vestige of that tracing back to cannibalism, right? And this idea of remembrance, of remembering the body back together that binds us together. So at that point in history, the sacred had been so desacralized to that point that they're not calling William Wallace this god. They're saying he's this legendary figure. So it's legend, not God, right? This legendary, larger than life. So I'm trying. You've got to see the fossil record of how human culture is preserving itself.
Yeah, and contextualizing
away from the sacrificial violence, and it's going to a new form. So when you look back at different periods of history, you can see mythology still wrapped up to some degree versus realistic portrayal of the truth. And that realistic portrayal of the truth is because of the gospel infection relative to that cultural moment for that society. For example, Gerard points out the story of Apollonius of Tyana, who was a myth maker that a lot of people like to compare to Christ as the pagan version of Christ at the time in that Greco-Roman world. And there's a story of Apollonius of Tyana, who is this miracle worker in Ephesus. And and the story starts off that Ephesus is in a plague and Apollonius is called to make this thing right. He goes there and he sees this crowd of people, and he sees a beggar, and this beggar. This is happening underneath the statue of Hercules, and he says that beggar is the problem. That's the monster. And the text says that the crowd has some hesitation at first. They're like, why? It's just a poor beggar. Right. So this isn't contemporary with the gospel story starting to spread in places like Ephesus. So this is right around Jesus' time when the revelation is starting to percolate. So in the text, you see the crowd is like a little bit hesitant. This is a far cry from earlier mythologies where it's primordial chaos and Marduk, and it's all mythologized. It's all symbolized. Now we're like, oh, it's a crowd. It's a guy. There's a plague. Okay, so the plague is a sign of myth. That's a piece of myth, because it could be just social tension that's reported as a plague, as a symbolic representation of social tension. So there's a little bit of piece of myth there, but we're getting some gritty realism. There's a crowd. They're a little bit hesitant. They're not really to kill this guy. And he's like, no, look. And so the beggar, he's blind. He looks up, he looks into their eyes, and they see a hellfire energy coming from his eyes, the text says, right? So we as modern readers, we're like, no, that's not true, right? Why don't we have that same suspicion with Oedipus Rex? We created an entire psychological foundation of the modern world with Freudianism around a frickin' accusation, just like the accusation of Apollonius of Tyana making against this poor beggar, right? You see what I mean? It's because it's more mythologized. It's more pre-Christian. The Christian context is already starting to eat up the narrative's ability to conceal the violence. Right. You read it and you're like, okay, so they see it, they're a little bit hesitant, then they look in his eyes, they see hellfire energy, and now they start to throw the stones. They throw so many stones, the text says, when they looked underneath the stones, he had transformed into a hellhound from the underworld. So now we see this. So Gerard says this text is like a transitionary fossil between one animal to another, right? Because you're seeing the pre-Christian would say it's a hellhound all the way through. This more post-cross event text has enough modernism to kind of demythologize the trappings of myth, so that we see, no, it wasn't a monster. It was a person, but somehow transfigured back into a monster once the sacrificial lynching was complete. So you can kind of see within a piece of text a transition between the pre-Christian mythology approach to creating meaning and order in a society versus the new order, where the Bible is going to undermine the reporting in a way, unconsciously somewhat, that makes the text a little bit more real, so that we can now see what's actually happening, right? We can see the dehumanization. The author doesn't see it like that. The author is reporting the story, and it's an earnest story. And it's an earnest story about how the world works. And the text says that the plague went away in Ephesus. So the miracle was successful. That's a total opposition to the miracles that Jesus is doing when the woman is accused of adultery. And he says, who's going to cast the first stone, right? So that's a mimetic contagion of nonviolence that Jesus is using in that story, where he's getting each person locked in that hive mind of anonymity and unanimity to take account for the piece of violence that they're going to participate in, right? Jesus is using social Aikido. In fact, he looks down. He doesn't lock eyes with them. Because if he had locked eyes with him, he probably would have ended up like the beggar in the Apollonius of Tyana myth, where he looked eyes at the crowd. They saw demon energy in him. They were projecting their own hateful mimetic desire for him into what they saw in him, right? Just like I said, we meet in a meeting. I act rude. You act rude. I saw you. It's all a wash. There's a crowd that joined you. I'm in trouble, and I become the beggar who's lynched. But the gospel inverts that. And Jesus doesn't go in there like we do, because we like to do our thing where, oh, you shall not do this, you shall not that. He doesn't go into that story and says, you cannot kill her. That's how non-aggression principle looks like in the way it's applied, and a kind of like thou shalt not thing. What's that going to do? That's going to invite and incite the desire more, because the law provokes, right? It's like the hot stove syndrome. You cannot touch that hot stove. Well, now I really want to touch it. And so Jesus doesn't say, you shall not kill her. It is wrong. You're wrong. What have you done, you cowards? He he averts his eyes so they can't mimetically project their violence into him.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't tell them not to do it. He affirms their desire, but he just deconstructs it, right?
Right,
Okay.
right.
He's joining them, but he's beating them by joining them. He's saying, okay, who's going to cast the first stone? And now they have to think, well, is it you, Bob? Or yeah, you're pretty sinful, and I don't know. What are you going to do? Now you're taking responsibility for the participation in the violence that at that point had been completely, you had been possessed by it, right? And so that's why, we have to apply that same thing for laws today. Like, are you going to be the one that, like, if you want to force vaccinate people, who's going to, subdue the first kid and forcibly inject them with a vaccine? I guess it's not you, is it? You just want to go along with unanimous consent to allow violence, but you don't want to do the dirty work of actually taking account for individually executing your participation in scapegoating. And so that's a way that you can use Jesus's social aikido in our own context today.
Well, and one of the things that I wanted to bring up is that humanity has a thirst for myth. And it's something that I've noticed most recently. Did you see the movie The Eternals?
No.
Well, it is a movie that's based on the comic books of Jack Kirby. But I found it fascinating because I listened. If you haven't checked out the Bible Project that Tim Mackey and John Collins do, check that out. It's very cool. But they did a series of podcasts on ancient cosmology, which has been just great to listen to. But I'm watching this movie, The Eternals, and what are they fighting but chaos? And what is the name of that chaos? It's Tiamat, which is one letter off from Tiamat, who was the person who fought Marduk in the Semitic myths that, I won't say preceded necessarily, but were contemporaries of the Genesis creation account. And it's amazing to me because we as human beings thirst for myth. We thirst for the hero that does redemptive violence on our behalf. So we have Thor, we have Iron Man, we have Obi-Wan Kenobi. We have all of these different archetypes of the hero that does violence to save the world. Jack Bauer, I think, is the most insidious of them, if I'm being honest. But it's interesting to me because, without this conversation, without looking into some of the mimetic theory stuff, I wouldn't have seen this. And so I'm very grateful for this conversation. I'm very grateful that you came on. I'm very grateful that you spent, at this point, 2 hours with us talking about this. But I do think that it is a situation that persists in the mind of man, despite Christ, despite the Christianization of the world, which I think has brought the most good that could possibly have come to this world. But what I want to do is, since we've hit the 2 hour plus mark, I do think we need to wind down to a close. Is there anything that you think we've missed? Anything? I mean, we can do this again. We can hit some more major points in the future.
Yeah.
But what do you think we might have missed?
I'm happy to answer questions from audience members or any questions you guys have to clarify anything I've said today. I would say that the scapegoat mechanism exists today, but not, right? Because it's not doing, it's a broken machine. Okay. So we have a bike, but it's all really messed up. You can't really ride it like it's supposed to be. So if you want to use an analogy, so it doesn't work. It doesn't function. Myth doesn't work. It only works in temporary, small, kind of schismatic ways. Like Trump functions as a kind of demythology. I mean, they even accused him of incest, which is what the god kings of sacrificial lore were accused of too. So they call him 45 instead of his name, right? They mock Trump. It's Drumpf to make him feel ethnically other, right, and different.
Right.
They tried to bring up that his name was Drumpf, or always trying to otherize him, to monsterize him, and all that. But it doesn't create unanimity, because every time you vilify someone, it creates a kind of martyr's mimetic double where people
Right.
rally around that perceived scapegoat and they say, hey, that guy's not what you're saying he's like, right? And then the other team says, well, he's not a scapegoat. Look what he said about Haiti. And then you say,
Look
well,
what he
oh,
said about the mentally deficient guy or the handicapped guy.
Oh,
right,
yeah.
right. Exactly. So that there's a counter scapegoating. So what's happening is the scapegoat mechanism is broken. It will progressively become more chaotic the more the button is pressed. Like, so every time you hit that scapegoat machine, it's not going to create order. It's actually going to create more schism and more vengeance, more alienation, and more people losing their mind. I think that's why people are losing their mind collectively with a mental health crisis like never before, like school shootings. I mean, that's like an apocalyptic unveiling of the violence of our empire that's starting to bubble up in these really wicked and horrible ways as people are acting out this hidden violence is starting to just blow up. And so the takeaway message is it's not, this theory is not like it has so much fascinating things you can take academically. You can go and study literature for the rest of your life in a new way, reading great works of literature with a mimetic triangular nature in mind. You can look at theology and be fascinated with Job and read Job in a whole new way, and Psalms, and you can go all over that, but it has a very timely and apocalyptic takeaway point, which is like, we have to do our part to rid ourselves of the romantic lie of the desires that we have, because that creates scandal. And where scandal starts, that's where chaos comes. And where chaos comes, that's where the cry for a scapegoat, a desire to blame and to kill and to hurt happens. So it starts with you repenting of the illusion of your desires that we end up indulging in and getting into all kinds of problems and becoming enslaved to our passions. That's a takeaway point from Girard that has apocalyptic importance in our time. If we don't stop doing this violence and this whole justification, the scapegoat mechanism will continue to lead to schism and chaos. So it's just a very timely message that we have to get out there. I wish, Girard is more popular than ever before. When I first started this, there was nobody doing podcasts about Girard. Now there's a lot of people doing stuff, trying to make online universities. But the one thing I am a little bit concerned about is that a lot of the people who are trying to build on what we've started and popularize Girard, they kind of downplay the Jesus part, right? And I'm like, no, that's everything. And you don't have to talk about it in a theological way. I can talk about it without, bringing any kind of spiritual or supernatural, as people would perceive it, into the conversation. And it still has just as much urgency and immediacy as something to reckon with, right? Because I always say, if Jesus was just a man, it's even a bigger miracle how his personhood revolution is so much shaping everything in the headlines today. I mean, you came and watched that Jurassic Park movie, the one that came out before. And the end of the movie is like, they're so worried about the plight of dinosaurs that they'd rather let them be unleashed into the suburbs to hurt us than to kill them. Like the sacrificial haunting of the cross is so infected in our imagination that even in everything we do, especially the things that draw the box office the most, are saturated with the question of how do we show mercy instead of sacrifice. That Doctor Strange, I saw that new one that came out. Yeah. And I didn't see the first one, but I saw the new one. All of them do the same thing. And I watched this movie. I'm like, it's so occult and it's got all this demonic stuff and stuff like that. But it's like, that's their text level, but the subtext is still Christ, right? Because the movie, I hope this doesn't bother or spoiler people. I don't really care, but because I analyze these things as anthropological texts, not as films, but when I'm talking this way. But the movie is basically dealing with, there's this witch character who is willing to kill anybody to save her children. So she's got this possessive love, right? This is very much kind of a pagan sacred approach to society. I would do anything to preserve mine and me and the extension of me and my children. So she goes through and kills all these people. And she's trying to kill this particular person. And the other people The good guys, they will do everything in the world, including lay down their life to save one life, where this other villain who's not fully a villain, because that's how Christian we are. We can't make our villains truly villains. We have to be relatable to our villains. So this villain, she is in such rage of the loss of her children that she'll kill anybody and sacrifice anybody to keep them alive. And the heroes are people who are laying down their life just to save one life, right? So
Right.
they're not killing everybody else. They're standing in the way of the bullets to save that one life. That is the Christian story. It's the haunting
Right.
of to sacrifice or not to sacrifice. That's what the Avengers was about. The guy, they're fighting and fighting and fighting, but the war doesn't resolve the problem until one particular figure lays down his life, and that somehow resolves the problem. You see what I mean? And so
Right.
we're so Christian we can't even comprehend it, you know. And so we
Well, and
have to follow it, or else we if the more we resist it, the more we fall into chaos, you know.
right. It's no accident that the magic that Scarlet Witch specializes in is chaos magic. It's no accident that in Genesis we have a polemic against chaos and against violence. It's no there are no accidents here, and I find that fascinating. Absolutely. So like I said, we are at about 2 hours and 16 minutes at this point. So typically that's when we tap out. But I do want to ask you the question that we do every episode, with the exception of the last episode, because when you have return guests, you can only ask them the same question a couple of times. But within the last 2 years, especially, there has been a lot of chaos. There's been a lot of unhappiness. There's been a lot of depression.
Mm.
And so one of the things that we set out to do when we rebranded from my old show into our show was we wanted to focus on hope. We wanted to focus on, particularly Christian hope, but hope in general. And so those who are outside of Christianity may not point to the same things we do and may just talk about it in the way of white pills. But what is something that you would like to share with our audience, with the people who listen to us, that gives you hope within this chaos, within the world we're living in right now? It could be personal, global, local, whatever. What's something that keeps you motivated to carry on and do what you do day to day?
But when Jesus was walking on earth and he's saying the first shall be last and the last shall be first, and he's looking at a local place of a theater or a place of like entertainment. If you went to that local entertainment in that world that he was in, if you were the last, if you were poor or disabled or sick, you wouldn't have the best seat in the house. You'd get the worst seat in the house. You'd get the peanut gallery. You'd be in a vantage point that would not be very interesting. In fact, if you were unlucky, you might be selected for that day's entertainment and fed to the lions if you had a handicap or a disability or poverty or something of that nature. And if you were the first, you were the general and you had the best seats in the house, or you're the aristocratic elites or the governor or the emperor, right? And today, when you go to a theater today, you don't watch actual violence. You don't watch animals tearing up people screaming in agony and people in a groupthink stupor cheering it on. You see simulations of violence and conflict on a screen, and you see that the best seats in the house are reserved for the handicapped, and they get the best seats in the house, and it's a sacred space. It's so much so that if the movie started and it's a packed house, and that that entire row of handicap seats are completely open, statistically, it's impossible for that many more, handicapped people to all of a sudden show up and fill up every one of those seats. You can go ahead and take that seat. It's okay. You can't find a seat in that crowded theater. Just sit. It's okay. The movie's already started. 3 minutes in, you're good. The odds that there's going to be enough that, you need to get up your seat, and they still will stay open. You know what I mean? Because our culture knows to respect the vulnerable and the weak that much more. 2,000 years after Jesus saw his world that he was in and did something about it, right? So the point I'm saying is that the fact that we have chaos shouldn't dishearten us, because this is the growing pains and the groans of a new creation that's being birthed, right? And and people who study birthing know that if you try to control the situation, sometimes that makes it more difficult than if you let. I mean, I don't want to speak as an expert, but just from what I've heard,
I have
you
5
know,
children. I know
yeah,
this.
exactly. So I'm sorry, like if you kind of like lean into the natural process rather than trying to fight it artificially, um, the process can produce a better thing. And so I say that as a caution to Christians and conservatives to not try to control and subdue the chaos with an attempt to use violence in the state to impose order on chaos, right? That's the temptation of the dialectic between the left and the right. But you have to be able to work with people where they're at and recognize that if the sacred violence is having to imitate and like camouflage itself more and more as an icon of Christ to get away with its act, that's a sign that the enemy is on the run, and the enemy is being vanquished, because in the old days they didn't have to hide anything. It's like, I have the might, I have the right, screw you, I'll do what I want. And now it's all of this painstakingly elaborate rhetoric and storytelling and self-justification and media myth making to try to paint a Christian icon over ugly violence. And so that's a wonderful story, because the enemy is on the run, he's hiding, and every time he hides, it falls apart and he's exposed. Just like the pandemic thing, we thought we couldn't get out of it, and a lot of people are now realizing this thing was a lot of evil, a lot of violence, a lot of wickedness. And just like the Ukraine thing starts out, everybody's like, let's go kill Russians. The more it saturates, the more the gospel technology gives us different perspectives from social media. And that decentralization of media that the gospel is what enables, by the way, the gospel enables and opens up decentralized media, because whenever you don't sacrifice to solve a problem, you turn to technology as a solution for it. And so as that continues in history, there's this weird, interesting relationship between the gospel opening up technology and then that new media technology being used to show the gospel truth of victims. And so the Ukraine story will start to show victims everything they do. The elite gatekeepers don't have a monopoly on myth making. And now we are at this rapid progression of the gospel technology starting to saturate media in this decentralized environment that's going to open up all kinds of possibilities for peace. So this is not, I believe Jesus is going to save the world, and he is saving the world, and that he will save the world even in our most ridiculous, stupid mistakes. He's like, oh, you're doing it that way. All right, I keto flip that into a beautiful thing as well. Oh, wow, you're really going to keep doing that. I'll still turn that one. And every time he's the greatest strategist with the worst team imaginable to execute his plays, but he still finds a way to win the game. So it's okay. We'll be all right. Just got to play our best.
That's great. I appreciate you coming on. I appreciate you talking to us. I do want to do it again. Like I said, I feel like we could dig into this for infinity, for all of the time.
Yeah. It's the greatest story ever.
I don't know what you knew when you came into this, but I started as a libertarian show, and we have every episode we become more and more a Christian show rather than a libertarian show. Because I have a degree in biblical studies. That's what I'm most interested in. Like, who cares about the rest of it? But I love the synthesis between philosophy and Christianity, because I mean, let's be honest, Christianity is a philosophy in a big way. But people seem to see it as, like you talked about earlier, this cordoned off area of life. Religion is separate from my real life. This is separate. This very Gnostic idea. But I appreciate you coming on. I appreciate you having this conversation with us. And we'll do this again if you're down for it.
Sure.
Um,
Thank you.
but I do want to let people know. Jessica, do you want to say anything before I get into the weeds of where to find him?
Oh no, just that I really enjoyed this, but I feel we barely scratched the surface of where we could go in this topic, and it was a real honor for me to benefit from listening to you talk about this. So I hope we could do it again.
I hope that we didn't, the problem with this thing is I realize I'm like, I try to get in as much as possible.
Right.
And I feel like sometimes it's too much, but then I'm like, but if I just give it to people, they might hit it and it might be like too much, but they'll feel like something cool happened and they'll want to go back and think about it more. Like
Right.
you just,
Right.
let it all out like an orchestra of all this stuff. They may get lost a little bit dizzy along the way, but they'll feel like that was a fun ride. There's something there.
Right.
Right.
Well,
I focus on like one granular thing. Yeah, I'll really master that thing on your factual knowledge part of you, but did I really intrigue you? But if I give you the full sweep all over of what
Sure,
Jesus
yeah.
is trying, what Jesus is doing, it kind of makes you like, whoa, I don't know
Well-
what that was, but I'm interested in Jesus now. All right,
Right.
thanks. That's kind of what I wanted to do. So
That's very very much what happened to me. I heard your episode with Bob Murphy in early 2019. And that was just at the exact right moment where I was ready to hear something different than sort of like the primary narrative. And so that I really appreciated it. And it's just amazing to have the opportunity. I feel really blessed to have been given that little bit of insight. Like you said, just that little spark of a thing that could send you off studying. And definitely, if you've listened to the end of this episode now out there in podcast land, check out the 5-part series on YouTube, the CBC interview with Renee Girard. It's wonderful. It really gets into the depth and then more of the nitty gritty of some of the stuff that we touched on tonight. So,
and you can't beat that French accent. I don't have that.
no, it's wonderful. Yeah.
One thing I wanted to mention, piggybacking off of what Jessica said, is that I was listening to an apologist the other day. And I loved what he said because he said, God doesn't need me to defend him. What my job is to say a single sentence that causes another person to research. It causes another person enough curiosity to follow the path that leads them to Jesus. And I think that that's beautiful. And I think that that's what we're here for. I think that that's what this show is here for. Because sometimes we have irreverent shows. Sometimes we have shows that have nothing to do with Jesus, but there's always a mention. There's always something. And it has borne a small amount of fruit. And in the future, I hope it bears great fruit. But if it's just that one sheep, the one that is left over from the 99 that are found, I'm happy with what we've done. But like I said, sorry, not to talk about myself too much, but I appreciate you coming on, and I want to let people know where they can find you. So for one, and you can add to this list, I try to find out all the cool things that people can go to so that you don't have to add to it, but I expect you will have to. But if you want to follow David on Twitter, you can follow him at David Gornoski, which is on the screen. If you want me to spell it for you, it's at David. You can spell that. I believe in you. And then Gornoski. And also you can check out his show online at aneighborschoice.com. Is there anything else you want to share with them?
Well, it's perfect. Yeah. I mean, I've got articles I haven't written in recent times, but I've got articles explaining. You just search for my name on search engines and different sites, Daily Caller and Town Hall and Newsmax and Lou Rockwell and Fee and all kinds of places. That's where I started first, is writing articles about this stuff. But there's a lot of archives out there that can kind of give you some essay forms if you don't want to read a whole book about mimetic theory. I've tried to take it and apply it to the political context of our time.
I'll be honest, I appreciate that approach because I didn't have time to listen to the Renee Girard 5-part video, and I tried to do some of the explainers that were on YouTube, and so many of those people are awful. Like
Yeah.
I got so
Yeah.
bored listening to them. So I'm glad you're out there to help people with that.
I try to take these ideas and make it so that people from working class backgrounds can understand something and use it and benefit from it. Because I mean, I
Meet
can,
people where
we
they
can
live.
talk in a hoity-toity way, but that's really not going to help anybody in the real world,
Yeah. And it's awful when they try. I mean, I have a degree. I
Yeah.
read constantly, but I swear to God, some of these things that I tried to watch, I was like,
Yeah.
you need to learn how to tell a story, dude.
Yeah.
Because if you don't do it with story, you're not going to grasp the people who need to hear it.
Exactly.
But beyond that, thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah,
Like I said, I'd love to do it again.
Sure.
So we'll be in communication. We're now mutuals on Twitter, so that's
I'm
cool.
new on Twitter. I started in last month or whatever. So
Run, bro, run.
Twitter's the best.
I avoided it all this time because I hated it. It was mimetic on differentiation. I was like, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do this. But every other platform, Facebook throttles me. I can't get in my content out there. And, YouTube deleted my channel after all that work.
Bummer.
And so I'm like, okay, well, I'm doing a radio show. I've got a podcast. I've got to have somewhere. And I'm on some of the other alternative platforms, but it's kind of preaching to a certain choir that I'm still trying to reach people who are not in my whatever, cohort of conservatives or Christians or libertarians, or whatever. So I'm like, all right, if Musk is really going to make this an honest free speech platform, I guess I'll show up and see if this would do anything, So I didn't want to go to Twitter. I'm very anti-Twitter. Here I am. It's like I don't have nowhere else. I think it's my Nineveh, where Jonah's like, I'm not going to those places. I hate that place. I'm not doing it. And God's like, no, I'm gonna freaking force you right back because you're not going to have any other access to any other platform. So just go back over to Twitter.
I feel like you would be a great person to talk to about the Book of Jonah.
Yeah.
And how it's a satire.
Yeah.
At some point, because most people don't know that.
Yeah.
But I will, unfortunately, because I feel like we could keep going. Jessica's past her quote unquote hard stop.
I have to go. I have an early appointment. I've had to go for like an hour.
But I'll let you go. I appreciate you. Thank you for doing this. Let's do it again. Let's figure that out.
Right.
Yeah, that's it.
All right. Take care.
I appreciate you.
Bye-bye.
See ya.
Thank you so much.
See you.
All right. So for the rest of you, what do we have coming up? I'm sure that's what you're wondering, or you're not because you don't care. And this is the first time you've seen us. But I'm going to tell you anyway. Next week, we have Josh Denny coming on, who had a show on the Food Network called Giant Food. And he was allegedly canceled. And so we're going to talk about that. He's also a comedian. It should be a good time. That's what we have next week. Right after that, we have a theologian coming on the show called Mark, whose name is Mark Ward. I'm not English, so I won't say called Mark Ward. He wrote a book called Authorized that is a look at the uses and misuses of the King James Version of the Bible. We had a conversation about versions of the Bible months ago, and I was left unsatisfied with the explanations, and he wrote a book about it. So we're going to talk about that. Beyond that, we have a new friend named Ciaran Warner, who is a journalist who is trying to take down a cult called The Body. He's on TikTok, and a lot of the stuff he's put out has been very fascinating. Apparently, one of the things he did in order to draw attention to this cult and try to bring it down was to threaten the life of Mitch McConnell. And so who does that? That's interesting. We're going to be talking to him. And then finally, we, at the end of every month, what we're going to do is we're going to decompress a little bit. We're going to have a friend on. And the plan that I have, which I haven't discussed with our guest yet, is to have our monthly Zoom meeting and game time with this guest who is a friend of the show. And so the end of the month, we're going to be talking to our good friend, Monica Perez, who I love, who everyone loves. And I don't know what we'll talk about, but we're going to decompress. We're going to talk over the month. We're going to talk over what's been going on. And we're going to find out what she's doing now that she left the daily Drive Time News Blast. So that's what's coming up in the future. Beyond that, Jessica, do you have anything you want to throw into the mix there? No?
No, good to go.
All right. So, if you want to follow me on Twitter, I am a sassy boy with some blue takes on things. You can follow me at Ham Carlos. If you want to follow Jessica, she's at Soup Canarchist. If you want to help us along and to financially support us while we make this show, you can go to patreon.com/the mad ones. That's where you get early episodes. Our episode with Mark Ward will be one that's recorded early, so you'll be able to be privy to that before anyone else. We also, like I said, we're going to be planning some Zoom parties with some cool people. We have a lot to offer, I think. So patreon.com/the mad ones. If you want to get a t-shirt and rep us out in public, we are the madones.com/store. You can get a tank, you can get a t-shirt, you can get a mug. Unfortunately, I'm an idiot and I broke mine, but it's very pretty. And my idiocy should not be a part of your decision whether or not to buy one. If you're listening, you can watch every Wednesday at 8:30 p.m. Eastern time on YouTube. That is unfortunately right now the best way to do it because you can be a part of the conversation. We will bring up comments. Sometimes, like tonight, it's a little bit of a heavy conversation, so I can't bring up stuff that will be distracting. But once we get to 1,000 followers on Twitter, once we get to 4,000 watch hours, we'll be able to use super chats, and those super chats will be brought up no matter what. So like us on YouTube, subscribe to us on YouTube, hit the bell, join us in this endeavor. Beyond that, if you don't like YouTube, we are also on Rockfin and Odyssey. And if you just want to listen, we're on every podcatcher there is, or wearethemedones.com. That's all I have. Did I miss anything?
Not that I know of.
Share the show with your friends. We have some great shows, I think. We have some great topics we've hit. We talked to a guy who is an embalmer and a autopsy tech, and people have questions about death, and you can share that episode with them. We've talked to a world-renowned musician. We've talked to all sorts of cool people. So share this show, tweet it, Facebook it, do whatever you can, because we do want to do more. We do want to talk to people who are quote unquote ungettable across the spectrum. We want to have interesting conversations about interesting topics. In that vein, please tweet at me, Facebook message me. If you have my phone number, text me and tell me who you want us to talk to. We just want to grow. We just want to do things that edify ourselves and edify you. So let's be a part of this process together. Is that all? That's all? All right. So as always, my wonderful friends who sit in here, me and Jessica and whoever we talk every week, you have a chance to be a light in the world. So go light it up.